Bem, bem-vindo ao seminário Natural User Experience, o primeiro evento do time de UX da Samsung e do P&D Samsung no Brasil. O encontro entre profissionais e pesquisadores de diversos centros de pesquisa e empresas para ouvir e discutir o design e a etnografia como ferramentas fundamentais no processo de inovação. Antes de começarmos, gostaria de enfatizar a importância da visão da Samsung como uma empresa global e inovadora, que, preocupada em atender às necessidades e expectativas locais, apoia o projeto e dá suporte a esse evento. Obrigada, Emerson, em nome da empresa. Obrigada pelos pesquisadores, Dr. Alex Gomes e doutora Sara Pink, pelo seu precioso tempo dedicado a compartilhar seu conhecimento conosco aqui hoje, e todas essas pessoas do ecossistema de tecnologia da região de Campinas e São Paulo. Para a abertura, então, eu gostaria de convidar o nosso diretor, Emerson Toledo, que vai dar umas palavrinhas aqui para a gente.
Obrigado, boa tarde a todos. Em nome do presidente do P&D aqui do Brasil, Raul Parque, gostaria de deixar algumas palavras com vocês hoje. Boa tarde a todos. É um imenso prazer compartilhar com vocês esse momento de pura inovação. Nas próximas horas, teremos a oportunidade de mergulhar em temas essenciais para todos nós, profissionais de engenharia, pesquisadores, institutos de pesquisa responsáveis por toda a cadeia tecnológica e por promover a experiência dos usuários. É a partir do nosso conhecimento e do nosso trabalho que as coisas saem do papel e tomam forma. Mas antes de desenvolvermos um novo produto ou serviço, precisamos entender o comportamento humano e as necessidades reais das pessoas. Por isso, nada melhor do que vivenciar as suas experiências e expectativas de forma mais profunda e natural. E a etnografia nos ajuda a compreender essas tendências, para onde as pessoas estão caminhando e onde devemos chegar para surpreendê-las. Um dos compromissos da Samsung é fomentar o ecossistema acadêmico, por meio de parcerias com as universidades, e assim contribuir com o avanço do Brasil e o desenvolvimento tecnológico na inovação. Uma das parcerias é com o Centro de Informática da Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, UFPE, que resultou neste evento hoje, enriquecido com a participação do RMIT, Universidade da Austrália. Entre as propostas desse evento está o compartilhamento de ideias e inovação aberta. Estamos reunidos aqui não apenas profissionais da Samsung, mas também empresas e pesquisadores de toda a cadeia tecnológica da região de Campinas. Vamos pensar juntos. Desejamos a todos uma tarde repleta de conhecimento e inspiração. Muito obrigado.
Bem, todos presentes hoje aqui já lidaram de alguma forma com inovação, seja do ponto de vista técnico, do ponto de vista administrativo, ou mesmo do ponto de vista criativo, né? E todos certamente, de alguma forma, já se viram confrontados as pessoas, a como as pessoas lidam com as coisas e as suas idiosincrasias, né? Então, já tendo passado pelas 4 ondas do design centrado no usuário, não tenho dúvida de que hoje temos total ciência da necessidade de focar não apenas no negócio, mas nas pessoas que usam as coisas pelas quais a gente está desenvolvendo. Então, enfim, a questão que eu olhar o agora, para como as pessoas lidam com algo neste momento, já não é mais suficiente. Então, as pessoas mudam, as inovações e novas tecnologias criam novas necessidades, as contingências se alteram a todo instante. Será que somos, assim mesmo, tão previsíveis? Como desenvolver soluções, sobretudo produtos que aparentemente são tão estáticos, para essas pessoas em ambientes tão inconstantes? Como prever o que vem depois, né? Como antecipar uma necessidade no futuro para que, quando usado, seja, de fato, adequado? Com tantas possibilidades, nossas soluções devem ser únicas ou oferecer múltiplos usos, múltiplas apropriações? bem. Com essas imagens, a gente deixa aqui 3 palavras que vão permear esse encontro e essa discussão da tarde: criatividade, apropriação e contingência. É sobre isso que a gente vai estar tratando hoje nas palestras aqui. Então, para abrir nosso evento, eu convido o engenheiro eletrônico e doutor em ciências de educação, professor Alexandro Gomes.
Uma grande satisfação encontrar com vocês aqui. E eu vou começar a minha fala pelas 2 últimas palavras do Emerson. Vamos pensar juntos. Tem um sentido maravilhoso nessa tarde, nesse momento histórico, né, do Brasil em tantas transformações. Queria agradecer o convite, em nome do Centro de Informática da Universidade Federal. É uma grande honra para a nossa universidade poder colocar toda a nossa estrutura, todos os nossos recursos a serviço da indústria brasileira. E estamos de portas abertas. Eu escolhi uma noção, o público é muito heterogêneo, com certeza que tem muitos cientistas da computação e de muitas outras áreas, perfis completamente diferentes, então eu escolhi uma palavra muito simples para começar essa nossa conversa, é a palavra raciocínio. Nós usamos essa palavra o tempo todo, eu vou usar essa palavra como um fio condutor para facilitar nesse nosso pensar juntos. E eu vou seguir esse roteiro aqui, bem simples. A gente vai falar sobre os raciocínios, o que significa, né? Como é que a gente vai pensar utilizando essa noção, esse conceito. Depois o raciocínio científico. Depois eu vou falar um pouco sobre um outro tipo de raciocínio, menos popular, o raciocínio de design. E como esses 2 podem contribuir ao nosso movimento, à indústria nacional, para a promoção de uma cultura de inovação ampla, efetiva, radical, disruptiva, com visão de futuro, né, de uma forma bastante tranquila. Então, a primeira coisa é dizer o que a gente entende, né? Qual seria essa ideia de raciocínio. Eu vou começar por um raciocínio que é muito familiar de todos os senhores. É o raciocínio que deu a origem, ou em outras palavras, como foi que Aristóteles inventou o computador. É o raciocínio dedutivo. É aquilo que está ali naquela parte em preto. Né? Se o homem é mortal, Sócrates é um homem, portanto, Sócrates é mortal. Esse raciocínio, o que é que eu quero chamar a atenção? Às vezes, as coisas tão óbvias do nosso dia a dia, as nossas capacidades de pensar de forma diferente, elas são tão óbvias que a gente, às vezes, esquece de tomar consciência do poder desses raciocínios. Esse aqui não. Esse aqui, nós usamos ele o tempo todo. Mas existem muitos outros. Na mesma Grécia Antiga, de onde herdamos o raciocínio dedutivo de Aristóteles, 3.500 anos, na mesma Grécia Antiga, os mesmos seres humanos utilizavam um raciocínio completamente diferente para imaginar o futuro. Eles se encontravam diante de diversos problemas e mitos, e eles frequentavam, esse é um quadro que está no Tate, em Londres, eles frequentavam as sacerdotisas, e as sacerdotisas utilizavam diversas maneiras de explicar os mitos. Era uma outra forma de raciocinar. Não se deduzia aquilo que não se entendia. A vida, o tempo, o ser, a natalidade, a fertilidade, etc. Então, outra forma de encarar os problemas do dia a dia era procurar uma sabedoria, uma crença meio mitológica. Isso não ficou perdido no tempo. Os seres humanos continuaram e continuam ainda encarando mitos. Há muitos mitos envolvidos no nosso trabalho do dia a dia, bem mais do que a gente pode imaginar. E esses raciocínios, eles são muito poderosos para que a gente não fique parado. De alguma forma, a gente abrace a urgência de tentar resolver, de avançar diante de uma dificuldade. Aqui é uma rainha da Inglaterra, e era muito comum que as rainhas tivessem os seus astrólogos. Outra forma de raciocinar, que era tentar encontrar uma correlação entre a posição dos astros e o que vai acontecer no dia seguinte, o que vai acontecer com aquela pessoa. Em várias igrejas, vocês devem conhecer Paris, quem já foi a Paris, tem uma igreja que tem uma cabeça deitada, a igreja de Santo Eustáquio. Na igreja de Santo Eustáquio tem um pilar e era onde o astrólogo de uma das rainhas subia para fazer a previsão olhando os astros. Na frente da igreja de Santo Eustáquio tem um pilar. Isso aqui é uma foto de uma rainha da Inglaterra. Então, a forma de pensar e de resolver problemas e resolver questões eram muito diferentes, e assim é. Eu poderia colocar aqui 50 outras maneiras diferentes de se raciocinar para resolver um problema, mas não vou fazer isso. Acontece que no meio dessa história, 3.500 anos para cá, a humanidade começou a organizar esses raciocínios, e aí, por volta, a história é muito lenta, é linda e lenta ao mesmo tempo. Só para dar um exemplo, no século V, mais ou menos no ano 400 depois de Cristo, perdurava a visão de mundo centrado no planeta Terra, o modelo heliocêntrico de Ptolomeu. Geocêntrico, né? Em 1000, mais ou menos, esse é um árabe, ele nasceu no Irã, onde hoje é o Irã, e nasceu em 940 e viveu até 960 até 1040, e ele é considerado o pai do raciocínio científico. Então, 5 séculos depois da proposição, ou seja, a humanidade inteira acreditava num determinado modelo, era um problema entender a evolução. 5 séculos depois, alguém consegue sistematizar um raciocínio que leva em conta a experimentação. Eu vou resolver um problema, mas eu vou testar essas soluções progressivamente. Mais 5 séculos depois, e a humanidade conseguiu medir o formato das órbitas, etc., e a gente chegou ao modelo heliocêntrico. Então, são 10 séculos de evolução, e o pensamento, esse raciocínio que a gente utiliza hoje, com tanta precisão, com tanta destreza, os humanos conseguiram evoluir, propagar, sistematizar, estruturar esse raciocínio com tanta beleza, com tanta precisão, com tanta perfeição, levou pelo menos 10 séculos para a gente conseguir amadurecer ele de uma forma completa. Isso aqui é um retrato esquemático, todos vocês conhecem essa estrutura, quem fez uma monografia, uma dissertação, um mestrado, pós-doutorado, etc., todo mundo conhece esse raciocínio, porque nós somos iniciados a ele. O raciocínio, esse é um raciocínio muito valorizado na sociedade ocidental, oriental. É um raciocínio que tem pelo menos 10 séculos de história, e ele colocou o homem na Lua. A gente atribui ao raciocínio científico a possibilidade de se comunicar globalmente, conhecer o espaço, prolongar a vida de uma forma extrema. Então, é um tipo de raciocínio. O raciocínio científico é um legado cultural humano que levou séculos e séculos para ser estruturado. E quando a gente entendeu isso, ele se transformou numa ferramenta muito poderosa de resolução. E ele ganhou um status tão profundo que, em meados do século XIX, 1850, um pensador, Hubler, um pensador alemão, ele andou pelo mundo e tentou criar o que seria uma instituição que propagasse esse raciocínio de uma forma sistematizada. Já existiam muitas universidades pela Europa, desde o século XIII, você já tem histórias de muitas universidades que ensinavam teologia, astrologia, etc., ciências muito próximas da metafísica e que não tinham o pensamento científico como o seu pilar. Nesse momento aqui, é um momento extremamente interessante, e nós somos frutos e consequências desse momento histórico. O racionalismo alemão criou uma instituição que especificamente ia se cuidar, ia se preparar para propagar com mais intensidade, de forma extensiva, o raciocínio científico. E tinha um ideal por trás disso. Vamos colocar o raciocínio científico ao serviço das nações, dos países. Isso deu tão certo que se espalhou pelo mundo afora. Na França, logo em seguida, a França de Napoleão criou a Universidade Imperial Francesa, que hoje é a Universidade da França, espalhada pelo país inteiro com o mesmo ideal. E eu gostaria de, antes de passar para o próximo passo, tem uma coisa muito interessante. Esse raciocínio, ele tem um status tão forte que ele ganhou quase que um templo. As universidades do mundo inteiro elas foram criadas para propagar isso, elas existem por isso, elas existem para propagar o método científico. Então, as universidades elas são quase como um templo. Tal é a relevância e a reputação desse método científico. Mas existem outros tipos de raciocínio. Vou contar uma história de um outro. Passei pelo mitológico, passei pelo astrológico, passei pelo dedutivo, passei pelo científico. Tem um outro, ele é muito interessante também, ele se chama raciocínio de design. O raciocínio de design, ele é tão antigo quanto o raciocínio, ele é natural. Não dá para dizer assim o ano que ele nasceu, o dia que ele nasceu. Esse autor aqui tem uma passagem do livro dele, o Nelson, ele tem um livro dele que ele diz o seguinte: nós não descobrimos o fogo, we designed the fire. Nós fizemos o design do fogo. Então, o ser humano, desde sempre, e tem filmes que fazem a apologia. O método científico, o método de design, o raciocínio de design, ele também tem um reconhecimento muito interessante em muitos cantos do planeta. Tem um filme, vocês vão lembrar dele rapidamente, que é um tributo ao raciocínio, à capacidade de fazer design do ser humano. Quem gostaria de falar? Eu não tenho dúvida, sai toda vez, aonde eu perguntar, pode ser em qualquer lugar, exatamente isso. Quando o macaco joga o osso para cima e tem uma estação espacial esperando o osso lá em cima. O filme é um tributo à capacidade humana de fazer design. E essa capacidade humana é nada mais, nada menos do que um raciocínio. Os traços e as características desse raciocínio também estão perdidos na poeira do tempo. Isso aqui é uma gravura da época do descobrimento do Brasil. Isso aqui, pela primeira vez, se encontrou um traço onde, na atividade humana de criar ferramentas, o artesão separou o tempo de planejamento do tempo de execução. Isso aqui é um traço de esquemas de alguns barcos, e esses traços serviram para pensar. É o que hoje a gente chama de sketches ou wireframes na indústria de software. Né? Isso aqui não era uma constante. Quando você queria fazer uma cadeira, queria fazer uma casa, queria fazer alguma coisa, o artesão ia lá e fazia. O tempo de planejamento e o tempo de execução estavam fundidos. Outra característica do pensamento de design é que ele depende muito desse traço. Isso aqui é um exemplo de um objeto de desejo. Essa cadeira, esse aqui é o Aaron Sarin. Ele é um designer dinamarquês e ele tem uma frase extremamente elegante que diz o seguinte: uma cadeira começa a existir quando eu faço o primeiro traço no papel. O raciocínio de design, ele tem essa necessidade de se apoiar em representações, de se apoiar em traços externos ao meu cérebro para conseguir evoluir. Eu não consigo fazer design sem uma representação externa. A consequência de um bom design são coisas de muito valor agregado. Essa cadeira é conhecida como a cadeira mais confortável do mundo. O nome dela é útero. E a hipótese de design do Sarin é o seguinte, que depois que a pessoa nasce, ela não encontra um lugar tão confortável no mundo quanto era o útero da sua mãe. Então ele tentou projetar uma cadeira que fosse a cadeira mais confortável do mundo. Essa cadeira deve custar em torno de R$3.500, R$4.500. As cadeiras famosas, clássicas. Né? Outra característica muito peculiar do raciocínio de design é a colaboração. O método científico ele pode ser muito solitário. Há umas 3 semanas atrás eu encontrei com um ex-colega meu, que eu fiz eletrônica, encontrei com um ex-colega meu que fazia matemática na época. Ele foi me visitar, tomamos um café, conversamos, etc. E aí ele mostrei o que eu estava fazendo, ele disse assim: calma, porque eu sou meio autista. A propósito, para ser matemático, ser autista é um pré-requisito. Então, isso não tem nada pejorativo. Na verdade, é simplesmente uma maneira diferente do cérebro funcionar. O autista ele consegue se abstrair e se concentrar em pontos muito específicos e abstratos que as mentes mais criativas talvez a gente não consiga fazer tão bem, e não faz tão bem quanto um matemático faz. E é aí o contraponto com o raciocínio de design. O raciocínio de design ele é eminentemente colaborativo. Não adianta pensar sozinho, mesmo que com representações, numa solução. Eu preciso interagir com pessoas. Eu preciso complementar os cálculos que eu faço no meio desse raciocínio, representar para que a outra pessoa consiga perceber o que eu estou calculando, porque não tem como se criar uma fórmula, não tem como resolver certos problemas, como, por exemplo, perguntar para um matemático qual é a forma mais confortável de uma cadeira. Não vai ter solução matemática. Então, o raciocínio de design, por ter essa faceta visual e colaborativa, experimentadora, tá certo? Ele consegue levar o ser humano a uma solução a este problema com tanta eficiência quanto o método científico colocou o homem na Lua. E aqui tem vocês devem ter conhecido esse professor, esse foi professor na USP durante muito tempo, Wilhelm Flusser. Ele tem um livro muito famoso sobre fotografia e um livro muito famoso sobre design. A história dele é muito parecida com o matemático Nespin, que quando se aposentou foi passear com a esposa, aí o táxi virou, faleceram os dois. Foi a mesma coisa com esse, ele viveu a vida toda, foi professor da USP, e aí foi visitar a família, depois que se aposentou, e a mesma coisa, o táxi virou e ele não voltou para o Brasil. Ele tem um raciocínio de design, ele começa a evoluir, ele começa a se estruturar, tão bonito quanto o raciocínio científico, no final do século XIX. Até ali, a produção dos bens duráveis eram feitos por artesãos. E os artesãos, tinham as guildas de artesãos, que o Brasil não viveu essa época. A gente importa tudo desde sempre, a arquitetura, os móveis, a decoração, etc. A gente sempre importou muita coisa. Tudo que a gente consome de design era sempre trazido de fora. Na Europa, de repente, a indústria, a Revolução Industrial provocou um fenômeno muito interessante, uma tensão entre as guildas de artesãos e a possibilidade de você produzir automaticamente bens de consumo. Quando as máquinas começaram a criar pratos, sapatos, imóveis, etc., a qualidade desses produtos eram inferiores à qualidade dos produtos dos artesãos. E aí começou a ter uma contra-revolução industrial, que foi a dos artesãos, dizendo assim, olha, essa qualidade é muito ruim, vocês deviam valorizar o do artesão. Mas não tinha como frear mais a revolução industrial. E aí eles se uniram, no finalzinho do século XIX para o século XX, e dizem assim, olha, vamos unir os esforços. Quando o Wilhelm Flusser diz no livro dele, vamos unir aqui a arte, que são os artesãos, com a técnica, para a gente criar a possibilidade de produzir mais e melhor bens duráveis. E aí deu-se um primeiro passo para a sistematização do design. E o design, ele vai se organizando, da mesma forma como há 5 séculos passados o pensamento do cientista, o design ele foi se organizando, e o Flusser, ele faz essa leitura, ele faz uma leitura etimológica, diz a palavra design, a gente pode ler como a gente entende hoje, design de unha, design de um monte de coisa, mas eu posso separar ele e dizer assim, o que é o design? Design é a capacidade de enviar uma mensagem para alguém. Em alguns lugares do mundo, se você perguntar para um designer profissional como é que é a tua atividade mental ao longo de um processo, quando você está envolvido num projeto de criação. Isso aqui é a representação desse raciocínio de design, mais uma característica dele. No começo ele é totalmente difuso, o que causa um tremendo mal-estar para quem funciona mais do lado dedutivo. Eu dou aula de IHC para engenheiros há muitos anos, num centro de ciência da computação, e o raciocínio de design incomoda muito o engenheiro, porque o modo de funcionar do cérebro de um engenheiro é mais voltado para o raciocínio dedutivo. Ele nunca exercitou resolver problemas dessa maneira. Não faz sentido resolver problemas dessa maneira. E faz. E há como se desenvolver isso. Do ponto de vista industrial, o raciocínio de design ele tem uma característica e uma relação econômica extremamente vantajosa do ponto de vista de sustentabilidade, de um sentido amplo. O raciocínio de design é aquele que, progressivamente, da mesma forma como Aaron Sarin desenvolveu aquela cadeira, progressivamente, o raciocínio de design vai eliminando dúvidas sobre como deveriam ser um novo produto para um público específico. Economicamente, você está mitigando riscos. Estrategicamente, você está mitigando riscos progressivamente. E o raciocínio de design ele também teve, diferente do raciocínio científico, que foi se organizando ao longo de 5 séculos, o raciocínio de design tem maternidade e certidão de nascimento. A maternidade dele é no interior da Alemanha, e a certidão de nascimento é o panfleto de abertura da escola de Bauhaus. Isso aqui os nazistas mandaram fechar. Era vanguarda demais e era tido como um movimento anti-germânico na época, mas não teve como parar. A vanguarda filosófica da Alemanha se juntou, e esse aqui é o livro do Gropius. Tem uma passagem aqui que naquela citação do Flusser aparece também. Ele coloca ali, vamos unir os homens artesãos e os artistas para projetar coisas interessantes. E a maternidade é essa aqui. Essa é a primeira escola de design do mundo. Ela também teve um status interessante. E tem data de nascimento, tem tudo. É maravilhoso, é lindo essa história. Agora, diferente do pensamento científico, que ele ganhou um templo inteiro, tá certo? Ele ganhou um templo chamado universidade, tá certo? O raciocínio de design, ele ganhou uma escola e departamentos. Então, não tem no mundo uma universidade que foi criada para difundir o raciocínio de design, que é nada mais, nada menos do que uma outra capacidade humana, é um outro legado da humanidade, tão bom e eficiente, talvez mais eficiente em muitos contextos, quanto o método científico. Aquelas estações espaciais, elas não foram para o espaço só por conta da engenharia. Tem muito design em cada peça para colocar um foguete no espaço. E uma coisa que pouca gente sabe, quem é de ciências humanas sabe que segue a forma de construir conhecimento das ciências humanas. Quem é das ciências exatas sabe que tem a forma de fazer ciência das ciências exatas. Pois quando se criou, quando se estruturou, quando a humanidade conseguiu estruturar tão bem claro como estruturou o pensamento científico, fez isso com o pensamento de design, surgiu uma terceira via, que é a forma de evoluir o conhecimento de design, que é conhecido, ele é muito difundido na Escandinávia, não é à toa que os produtos que nós mais desejamos possuir, como carros e tantos outros itens, vêm dessa região, porque essa cultura, de certa forma, a gente vai ter uma passagemzinha que a gente vai ver por quê, se difundiu e se propagou no dia a dia de alguns países, como a Suécia, a Holanda, a Dinamarca, etc. Então, essa é a terceira via. E aqui é uma representação. Da mesma forma que tem aquele desenho lá, aquele ciclozinho do raciocínio científico, o raciocínio de design, ele tem uma estrutura e a gente consegue formar pessoas para raciocinar mais e melhor com esse raciocínio. E porque em alguns lugares do mundo, o design ele está presente de uma forma muito natural. Isso aqui é uma explicação do livro do Koskinen sobre o Design Science Research, que ele diz o seguinte, olha, a palavra coisa tem raiz germânica. Quando você vai para o sueco, a palavra ting, sem o H, significa assembleia. Quando você lembra da palavra assembleia, uma das características do raciocínio de design é que ela é colaborativa. Quando você junta as duas coisas, design thinking, não significa alguém sozinho fazendo o desenho de um objeto. Significa um conjunto de pessoas que vão se juntar para juntos raciocinarem a solução de um novo objeto. Isso está nos países de língua germânica. Nós não temos influência germânica no nosso idioma. Nossa cultura é diferente. Talvez por isso que o raciocínio de design na América Latina e em outros lugares do planeta seja uma coisa muito exótica. Isso eu estava, há um mês atrás, eu e o Thiago, a gente estava num evento lá em Maceió. Isso aqui é um colega do Japão, ele é o criador praticamente, a segunda pessoa no mundo a estruturar a área de ontologia, de engenharia de conhecimento, Mizoguchi, o nome dele. E a gente estava conversando, etc. E eu, por curiosidade, comecei a falar sobre design. E aí eu mandei para ele o livro do Koskinen, e aqui embaixo está a resposta que ele me mandou. Ele disse, poxa, que legal, achei muito interessante essa frase, design como uma forma de fazer coisas. Só para dar uma ideia de que, dentro da academia, o raciocínio de design, ele não só tem o mesmo status, ele tem um status completamente diferente do raciocínio científico, como ele chega a ser desconhecido. E, na verdade, eles são gêmeos que foram separados na maternidade. Não é? Você tem um lado que faz parte do serviço, mas ele precisa muito do outro. Na verdade, a gente precisa muito mais do lado emocional para viver do que o lado racional. Se o lado emocional de um ser humano normal não estivesse funcionando, você consegue ver as coisas, mas você não consegue dizer o que é a coisa que você está vendo. Então, o que eu gostaria de passar, a mensagem que eu gostaria de passar, é que são apenas dois lados de legados culturais da humanidade, poderosos legados culturais da humanidade em forma de raciocínio, que infelizmente não tem o mesmo status e o mesmo reconhecimento para resolver problemas em diferentes contextos, mas que eles são excelentes ferramentas para inovação. E aí chegou a palavra inovação. E eu não podia falar de inovação simplesmente citando Christensen ou Drucker, não poderia falar de inovação de uma forma abstrata. Eu estou falando de inovação no sul da América Latina. Significa que a nossa história, a história de cada um de nós fomos formados em instituições que supervalorizam o raciocínio científico, praticamente desconhecem o raciocínio de design e têm o mesmo modo de funcionar há 150 anos, pelo menos. Nós somos cópia da universidade francesa e americana. Cada um de nós pensa desse jeito e a gente acredita, a gente sai de lá dizendo assim, poxa, esse é o certo, qualquer outra coisa além disso aqui, eu não deveria fazer. Só que, será que essas instituições ainda, elas são suficientes? E falar de inovação é falar também das relações econômicas que estão por trás. E como estamos na América Latina, a gente tem uma história muito pesada, né? Então, eu tenho aqui o modelo de inovação. Estou tentando, desde hoje, acender aqui o farol e não consigo. Vai sem. Então, aqui a parte vermelha, esse aqui é o modelo, a definição de inovação é a definição econômica, da década de 50, de Schumpeter, Peter Drucker, ele vai sistematizando isso. E tem uma relação econômica entre eu inovo, estou à frente do mercado, sempre que eu criar alguma coisa que é desejável, que a engenharia diz que eu consigo executar, e a quantidade de coisas que eu vendo daquilo ali torna aquele produto uma coisa sustentável. A gente pode olhar simplesmente do ponto de vista contábil, mas eu posso ter uma visão muito diferente, né? Recentemente, em 2010, surgiu essa via, né, do design sustentável e tem também a via pós-colonial. Quais são os efeitos de uma colonização num país como o nosso que nos aprisionam na forma como nós conseguimos raciocinar o nosso futuro? E aí, aquilo ali complementa a definição econômica do que vem a ser inovação. Né? Sempre que você está pensando numa nova tecnologia num país como o nosso, ou a partir de um país como o nosso, é importante entender quais são as relações de poder e como essa tecnologia se insere de uma forma sustentável no fluxo contínuo de desenvolvimento histórico de um país. Por isso que no começo eu disse, esse momento é um momento histórico. E aí eu me lembrei eu vi sem querer, eu achei sem querer, mas eu achei super, super elegante. Sabe aquela coisa de você abre uma loja no centro da cidade, fica por 10 anos e decidiu fechar a loja, aí você coloca uma nota de desagravo no jornal, agradecendo a todos os seus clientes, né? Então, foi mais ou menos o que fez o Paolo. O Paolo, ele é executivo de um estúdio de design italiano, que quando o Brasil saiu pela primeira vez na capa do The Economist, está todo mundo lembrado, né? A primeira, é uma sequência de 3 fotos, né, na capa do The Economist, né? A primeira é o Cristo Redentor decolando, né? Então, quando deu aquele momento, o estúdio de design do Paolo, é o Pininfarina, vocês podem não saber o que é o Pininfarina, mas com certeza vocês já desejaram alguns dos produtos desse estúdio. Aí o Paolo Pininfarina projetou uma lancha de super luxo. Ele fez uma lancha assim, daquelas lanchas assim toy for boys, sabe, aqueles objetos de desejo, assim, luxuosíssima. Produziu 40 unidades, vendeu 38 delas para brasileiros. E aí ele abriu os olhos e disse assim, o Brasil acordou para o design. Não teve dúvida, se instalou isso aqui em São Paulo, fez 250 visitas, mandou 100 propostas, fechou um contrato com uma multinacional estrangeira e colocou essa notinha no Estadão. Ele disse assim, o brasileiro não leva o design a sério. Eu perdi 2 anos e meio da minha vida aqui. Ele conta a história, é fácil achar, porque está aberto no Estadão, essa matéria, mas é muito interessante e ele vem meio que coadunar com essa ideia de que o raciocínio de design, por mais que ele seja um legado de qualquer um de nós, no Brasil a gente não leva ele a sério. E o que seria levar a sério? O que seria a gente conseguir se libertar de um raciocínio europeu? Ou seja, como é que a gente conseguiria, no Brasil, pensar fora da caixa de uma instituição, sendo nós constituídos e formados, nós somos profissionais que nos constituímos numa instituição que tem os moldes de uma universidade europeia do século XIX. Como é que a gente pode se livrar disso? Aí eu trouxe aqui um exemplo que é um paralelo das artes plásticas. Esse aqui é um quadro que praticamente ele define a nossa identidade como brasileiros. É a primeira missa do Brasil. Eu vi esse quadro no Museu do Olhão, lá em Curitiba, Museu do Niemeyer. Eles fizeram o restauro do quadro. Eu vi o processo, aí uma vez eu fui lá, estava com ele exposto, maravilhoso a forma de restauro, é gigante esse quadro. Mas esse quadro é muito interessante, veja. Eu tenho uma representação absolutamente clássica, romântica, tá certo? Do que foi o encontro dos índios, os índios ali quietinhos, assistindo à missa, uma perspectiva greco-romana perfeita, os objetos todos com a beleza e a proporção grega, né? A natureza, o bucolismo do romantismo europeu do século XIX. A propósito, dizem que a humanidade evoluiu até mais ou menos a época de Mozart, lá para cá só vem ladeira abaixo. Mas aqui é uma representação de uma outra parte do mundo que utiliza uma linguagem plástica herdada de outra cultura para representar um fato seu. Isso aqui é isso aqui fala de colonização. Olha o que eu vou fazer agora quando eu passar o próximo slide. Eu vou dar um exemplo de como as artes plásticas, lindíssimo os movimentos de arte contemporânea pelo mundo, como é que as artes plásticas conseguiram se libertar dos cânones europeus. Então, aqui também fala de colonização. Isso aqui é uma instalação da Adriana Varejão, que eu também visitei, lá no Inhotim, em Brumadinho, no meio de Minas Gerais. Recomendo. Talvez a experiência mais linda que eu já tive com arte na minha vida. E aqui ela fala também como é que uma estética portuguesa tão bonita esconde tanto sofrimento. Também é um retrato da nossa colonização. Só para fazer um paralelo de como setores, né, da humanidade, no caso aqui as artes, conseguem se libertar de uma forma de raciocinar para se pôr no mundo e avançar o entendimento sobre problemas, etc. Então, o nosso efeito pós-colonial, todos os estudos pós-coloniais é para dizer o seguinte: dado que você passou por um processo de colonização, qual é o efeito na tua literatura, na tua forma de fazer política, nas questões de gênero? E aí você não vai analisar 150 anos depois, porque aquilo ali pode ter sido diluído, pode evoluir para uma coisa diferente, melhor, etc., mas é mais ou menos o que se faz. Na nossa indústria, tá certo? Na área de HC especificamente, tem muita gente que tenta entender quais são os efeitos de um processo de colonização na capacidade de uma determinada cultura avançar. E o que a gente tem que se livrar, alguns aspectos que a gente tem que se livrar, são esses aqui. Isso aqui é uma citação de Sérgio Buarque de Holanda no livro que fez 100 anos, há poucos anos atrás, que Ele diz o seguinte: a Universidade Brasileira surgiu em cima de uma torre de marfim. Era uma forma simbólica, olha só, além de ser um modelo europeu, a Universidade Brasileira é uma forma simbólica de manter o poder da aristocracia rural. Então você nasce desse jeito, ou seja, eu estou muito longe dos problemas do chão. Eu estou em cima de uma torre, é quase que o platonicismo, uma coisa bem abstrata. Eu vou pegar para mim problemas que são interessantes para mim, são importantes para mim, não necessariamente estão relacionados à realidade. Elas são réplicas das universidades europeias e americanas e há uma pequena valorização dos problemas cotidianos do dia a dia. É o que a professora Sara vai falar daqui a pouquinho, que é tudo o que na literatura internacional de sociologia e antropologia estuda hoje, que é o dia a dia das pessoas, em casa, pegando ônibus. Do ponto de vista do ensino de design, a maior parte das escolas de design no Brasil tem influência da forma como a escola de Bauhaus foi concebida. O método de ensino é da década de 20 do século passado. Então, o racionalismo, o designer mais fechado em si, etc. A gente não tem uma pegada do tipo, isso é dos... E outra coisa interessante das escolas de design é que o raciocínio fica preso na escola de design. Ninguém ensina design como um curso introdutório para engenheiros de software, para engenheiros de uma forma geral. Aliás, nem é obrigado no Brasil a cadeira de interação humano-computador. Algumas universidades colocam porque querem, ou colocam como eletiva. No meu curso, são 30 horas de 3.060, 0,03%, já fiz a conta, 0,03% do tempo da graduação de engenheiro de software é para ele entender como lidar com o que hoje a gente sabe que corresponde a 80% da linha de código de qualquer produto de software, que é a interação com o usuário. Mais ou menos a conta. Outra forma da gente fazer, fazendo um paralelo do que as artes plásticas fez, as universidades, o que significa trazer um problema do dia a dia para dentro, para tratar com o problema, com o raciocínio científico, junto com o raciocínio de design. É o que o Edzegovitz chama de tríplice hélice, a inovação da tríplice hélice. Como é que eu consigo fazer dialogar o método científico que está encastelado na universidade, potencializar o raciocínio de design que está ainda mais escondidinho dentro do departamento de design, com uma reputação bem inferior, fazer esses dois irem à rua, irem à casa das pessoas, entender o que é que as pessoas estão vivendo, sofrendo, passando em termos de consumo de TI, por exemplo, para gerar uma solução que seja uma inovação interessante para países como o nosso. Só para dar um exemplo que isso é possível, o trabalho desses pesquisadores aqui na área da educação. Todo o esforço da educação no Brasil inteiro é para ensinar as 4 operações para as crianças. Esses pesquisadores descobriram que as crianças naturalmente sabem fazer as 4 operações. E elas as fazem utilizando representações que elas próprias inventam. Então, descobriram que, diferente da forma clássica do ensino, tentar ensinar as crianças, era mais interessante tentar, a partir do raciocínio das crianças, fazê-los evoluir até a forma mais sistematizada. É um exemplo de como a pesquisa pode encontrar um caminho do meio para resolver um problema. Eu não vou entrar em detalhes. E aí vocês lembram daquela gravura lá do começo, né, que está no Tate, onde tem várias pessoas frequentando o templo das sacerdotisas para resolver os mitos. Pois muito bem, isso aqui é um livro de 2011 e o rapaz que aparece na foto, ele é o Mark Weiser. Infelizmente faleceu muito jovem, com 43 anos, em 1999. Ele era um cara hipervisionário. Ele diz o seguinte, eu vou citar ele aqui, porque ele criou uma coisa muito interessante na área da gente. Ele criou um mito dentro da área de ciência da computação. E a gente se encontra com o mesmo nível de dúvida que uma pessoa que ia frequentar a sacerdotisa lá na Grécia Antiga, ou uma rainha que procurava um astrólogo para saber como deveria ser o futuro. E o título do livro, que é escrito a 4 mãos, por um cientista da computação de inclinação de ciências humanas, e uma antropóloga de inclinação à ciência da computação. Olha o título do livro, Adivinhando o Futuro, como é que a gente pode lidar com a bagunça e o mito da tecnologia pervasiva. Que é o Weiser, o Mark Weiser, ele cria, num artigo da Nature de 1991, ele cria o programa da computação pervasiva. Ele diz o seguinte, ó, vai ter um tempo onde eu vou estar, as coisas vão estar tão invisíveis, que a computação vai estar tão imbricada no meio dos outros objetos, que vai ser muito natural, e eu vou utilizar como sem precisar nem pensar que eu estou utilizando. Ele lançou isso e criou um tremendo problema, ele criou um mito, literalmente um mito da tecnologia calma. Ninguém sabe como é que vai ser a smart house, os carros do futuro, etc. Então, foi o que ele fez, ele antecipou o futuro, ele formulou uma pergunta e todos nós nos encontramos no estado de ainda transformar esse mito em problema. E para resolver esse problema, nos últimos, 30 anos, a gente viveu pelo menos 3 ondas, que é o que a Renata falou quando ela estava apresentando. As 3 ondas da interação humano-computador. A primeira delas é mais ou menos o que a gente aprende na faculdade, que a gente deveria cuidar... Como é que está o meu tempo, Renata? Dentro da área da ciência da computação, quais são as ferramentas e técnicas que eu vou utilizar para lidar e abordar esse mito da tecnologia calma? Eu estou tentando acalmar a tecnologia desde que eu comecei a difundir para as pessoas, na década de 80, quando nasce a área de interação humano-computador, e nessa época você não tinha outra alternativa, você herdou conhecimento de outra área. Então, tudo que se tinha conhecimento da área de fatores humanos, que era mais antiga, da década de 70, criado no meio da Europa, e da psicologia cognitiva, a ciência da computação puxou para si e disse assim, olha, faz o código e depois a gente coloca o usuário no laboratório, a gente vai testar como ele se comporta, igualzinho como o pessoal faz lá no departamento de psicologia, e depois que a gente conseguir fazer uma interface que não vai dar muito trabalho para o usuário, a gente coloca isso no mercado. Deu certo? Não deu certo. Então a gente fez um trabalho muito bonito, isso aqui é um protótipo que foi pensado por muitos antropólogos, é na época daquele filme Piratas do Vale do Silício. Isso aqui, os antropólogos da Xerox, isso as interfaces gráficas que nós utilizamos hoje, eles foram especificadas em 1973. Esse documento tem mais ou menos umas 400 páginas, e ele foi feito com muita antropologia e com muita etnografia, tentando entender como as pessoas utilizam objetos nos escritórios. Então, as metáforas que a gente utiliza até hoje é isso aqui. E na primeira corrente, na primeira tentativa de acalmar a tecnologia na área de ciência da computação, a gente criou isso aqui, criou a ideia de metáfora. Né? Bom, já que eu estou imaginando só as interfaces, né, então eu posso reutilizar esse conhecimento. Muito bem. Mas aí eu vou fazer uma pergunta para vocês. Vocês acham que agindo dessa maneira, ou da forma como a gente trabalha, em algum momento da nossa atuação como engenheiro, a gente chega a considerar o usuário como uma pessoa desprovida de corpo, de mente, de identidade? Vocês acreditam que a gente, em algum momento da atividade da gente, chegou a considerar o usuário como uma pessoa mais ou menos assim? Me lembrei agora a historinha do rei Du, né? Sim, pessoal, a gente faz isso. Nós tratamos o usuário como uma pessoa que não tem identidade, não tem nacionalidade. Muitas vezes, ele não tem identidade, ele não tem endereço, ele não tem pai, não tem mãe, ele não tem cultura, ele não tem nada, certo? Então, durante muito tempo, a engenharia de software tratou o usuário dessa maneira. A gente considera ponto de partida, muitas vezes dessa maneira, esquecendo que ele tem sentidos. Pelo menos que ele tem os 5 sentidos. Né? E o resultado é esse. Né? O primeiro encontro, a gente vai fazer uma nave espacial, ele quer dar um pulinho, né? Ele quer sair do chão, o usuário quer sair do chão. Aí você reúne os designers e diz assim, olha, a gente vai fazer um super foguete espacial com antenas de titânio, etc, etc. Aí o que você consegue de dinheiro e de tempo para fazer? Você faz aquele foguetinho, mas na verdade ele queria uma rampa para sair do chão. Né? Tem um monte de figuras como essa. E aí esse reuso, o fato de ter focado para resolver a questão da tecnologia calma, de ter focado no produto, não resolveu. A gente ficou da década de 80 até meados da década de 90, E aí não resolveu de jeito nenhum. E aí, eu conheço esse colega, Liam Bannon. O Liam, é muito interessante contar a história do Liam, para saber por que é que uma pessoa, como é que uma pessoa consegue pensar fora da caixa. Aqui é outro exemplo. O Liam fez a graduação dele na década de 70, eu estive na casa dele há uns 5 anos atrás, ele esteve já com a gente umas 3 vezes, ele se aposentou. O Liam, ele fez graduação na década de 70, na Irlanda, e o currículo dele é diferente. Ele tem um minor em alguma coisa, no caso do Liam, ele tinha um minor em tecnologia e tinha um major em humanities. Então, ele sabia que o problema, ele não olhava só para a máquina, né? Ele sabia o que era cognição, ele sabia o que era aprendizagem, ele sabia o que era cultura, etc. E ele frequentava muito a Dinamarca, certo? Então, 20 anos depois de ele terminar a graduação, ele escreve um artigo muito interessante, onde ele diz o seguinte: o design, ele é um processo colaborativo. E nesse momento ele diz o seguinte: o usuário não é uma pessoa desprovida de características, e nem ele vai ficar quietinho no lugar dele enquanto eu pergunto para ele o que é que ele quer, que é a famosa, a incontornável entrevista de licitação de requisitos. Você vai lá e pergunta: o que é que você quer que eu faça para você? Essa é a primeira pergunta de todo aluno de graduação, quando você vai visitar o usuário, pergunta, descubra o que ele quer. Aí ele faz a pergunta: o que é que você quer que eu faça para você? É incontornável essa pergunta. E o Liam diz o seguinte, ele começa uma segunda onda, que é: não vou focar na interface, mas eu vou colocar o usuário para assumir um papel ativo comigo no processo. E ele vai assumir papéis diferentes enquanto ele projeta comigo essa interação. E ele deixa de ser usuário e passa a ser ator. E aí surge toda uma pleiade. O que era só as teorias da psicologia cognitiva, a gente tem uma herança, vai se acumulando isso, mas o essencial aqui é que a gente sai de um paradigma de interface da década de 80 para um paradigma de interação, abstrato ao extremo para explicar para o engenheiro que ele não deveria se preocupar com a interface. É a última coisa que a gente se preocupa, é a interface. A interação é aquela que sai da arquitetura para baixo. Todo o código, ele é design, todo o código, não só a tela, todo o código, ele tem que ser pensado junto. E ele pensa isso porque nessa época as experiências com telas grandes e telas pequenas começaram a aparecer, a ideia de metáfora, não dava para colocar metáfora em todo canto, aqueles objetos lixeirinha, etc., que era a ideia de kineomórfico, né? Quanto mais parecido com o objeto, melhor para o usuário. Isso não funcionou, isso de certa forma impactou, as interfaces impactaram na cultura, as pessoas estavam mais afeitas a utilizar coisas flat, etc., e aí a palavra interação entrou em cena. Conseguir se livrar da interface e pensar a interação, a experiência. Mas isso ainda não era suficiente. E aí vem um terceiro movimento dentro da área de ciência da computação. Esse terceiro movimento do IHC é o movimento atual, que ele encontrou a terceira onda da TI, né? Que a primeira onda é o mainframe, a segunda é o PC e a terceira é desaparecer com eles, que é o programa de pesquisa do Mark Weiser. A terceira onda do IHC, tá certo? É exatamente você tentar entender o processo de design como uma coisa situada, onde você não está de fora observando a situação para elicitar requisitos, seja qual for a técnica que você está utilizando, mas você faz parte da cultura, você está ali. Ao mesmo tempo que o usuário está ali, mas não está consciente porque ele está dentro da cultura dele e ele não vai poder falar para você. Então, de alguma maneira, o papel do designer é entrar numa cultura e dentro dessa cultura viver um momento de aprendizado mútuo entre o ator e o designer para que juntos eles caminhem num processo de criação. E aí eu deixei em destaque aqui uma coisa bem interessante, que o designer, ele é uma atividade construtiva ongoing. Ela não para. Eu vou lá, vejo o que ele precisa, volto, vou pensar a solução e um dia eu entrego. Não. É um processo ongoing, assim como o desenvolvimento de um país. Não para. Lembrei de um cantor da minha época, mas não vou parar não agora. E eu destaquei ali uma coisa muito interessante, porque é exatamente o tema que talvez mais incomode o engenheiro, que é a questão das emoções. Eu sou da área de HC e quando eu interajo, eu convidava alguém da área de requisitos para uma banca minha, ele ficava horrorizado com os resultados de HC, porque a gente utilizava métodos qualitativos, mas assim, mas rapaz, isso é muito subjetivo. Isso não pode, aqui dentro da universidade, não pode, não é aceitável uma coisa dessa, é subjetivo demais para considerar como verdade. Entendeu? E aí, a terceira onda do IHC, ela é radical. Né? Só, designer, use todo o seu corpo para você sentir as mesmas sensações do que o teu usuário e juntos vocês vão aprender quais são as necessidades e desejos. E você não me volte aqui só dizendo o que você viu. Você vai tentar ver, inclusive, as coisas que não são visíveis, como uma emoção, desejo, né, e diversos outros aspectos que ele não vai falar e nem vai fazer. Você vai ter que ver no corpo dele. O teu corpo vai sentir as sensações dele. E aí, faz mais sentido se na primeira onda eu pensava só na interface que estava na tela dessa pessoa, na segunda onda eu pensava no gesto dela interagindo, a interação, os estilos de interação. A terceira onda diz o seguinte, olha, a tua unidade de análise não é nenhuma dessas, é tudo. E aí, quando a gente diz isso, é tudo, a área de HC fica equivalente ao que se faz hoje na sociologia e na antropologia visual, quando diz o seguinte, a unidade de análise para entender o dia a dia, as atividades do everyday things, a unidade de análise chama-se everyday things. É tudo. E o probe, o sensor, é você, é o próprio. E aí, dentro da área de design, wake up, Cira. I'm talking about you. Dentro da área de design, a área de HC, dentro da ciência da computação, ela encontra um parceiro muito forte dentro da antropologia, tá certo? Que é uma especialidade dentro da antropologia, que é o design etnográfico como uma terceira corrente. Aliás, o design tem muitas correntes, mas o design etnográfico, ela é... Eu peguei uma frase aqui da Sara, vê se eu escrevi certo ali, Sara. Participantes e etnógrafos constroem conhecimento e lugar. Ela vai explicar o que é lugar, tá certo? Eles constituem conhecimento e lugar juntos, quando eles fazem um passeio pela casa. No caso aqui é um exemplo, era um projeto para a casa. Né? Isso permite a um etnógrafo sensorial focar em como o lugar dele ou dela, né, pode ser entendido e se constitui para ambos como uma experiência dos participantes. E a descrição dela ou dele é eminentemente uma questão de criatividade, ou seja, é uma coisa assim que é diferente da forma como a gente é formado naquela visão da universidade de 1950, que formou a gente a um conhecimento estático. Isso aqui é um conhecimento em movimento. E é um dos conceitos que ela utiliza na abordagem dela, que é a noção de movimento. Né? Isso é paradigma, isso é forma diferente de ver o mundo. Eu queria ficar por aqui. Entendo que esse momento é um momento extremamente importante da nossa cultura brasileira, tá certo? Porque a gente está colocando em questão valores e princípios muito postos, muito arraigados. A gente não consegue pensar em inovação sem tomar consciência da maneira como nós fomos constituídos e sem tomar consciência de que nós reproduzimos certos modelos mentais de resolver problemas que sejam muito inadequados para o momento que a gente está vivendo hoje. Muito obrigado.
Agora vamos entrar um pouquinho mais nesse tema, que é design etnográfico. Então, so I would like to invite Ms. Sarah Pink, the Distinguished Professor and Director of Digital Ethnographic Research Center at MIT, Australia.
Hello everybody. Many thanks, Renata, for inviting me here. It's fantastic to be here in Brazil and to be able to speak to you. And many thanks also to Alex for his fantastic talk and for the lovely introduction to my work at the end. So I'm really, really, really delighted to be able to start with such lovely introductions. So today I'm going to be talking about design, ethnography, and the technological possible. It follows on from Alex's talk, and it takes us much more close to ethnography, to people, to our experience of everyday life, the world around us, and so many of those things about everyday life that are most important, but that are almost invisible. Those things that we do every day without thinking about them, without even realising, the things we don't necessarily ever tell people about because we don't think that they're important enough. One of the things I want to emphasise is that those things that are almost invisible, those things that we don't necessarily talk about, are actually some of the most important things. And they're some of the most important things for design because they underpin nearly everything that we do. Some of my research is about things that we might think are quite boring. One of the things I do research about is laundry. We all really hate laundry. It's really boring. But if everybody in this room didn't do their laundry themselves or have somebody else do it for them, what would you be wearing today? Maybe nothing. Maybe you buy new clothes every day of your life. I have heard stories that there are some people who do that kind of thing. But really, you haven't probably spoken to anybody in this room about your laundry. But that's one of the most important things in your life. There are many other things like that. And those are the things that we really need to know about if we want to design for people. We want to design things for people that they'll take into their futures with them and things that will be really useful for them in everyday life. Now, I guess that a lot of you work in technology design. You may think that the only technologies that are really useful for thinking about laundry might be things like washing machines. But actually, mobile phones are really important when we do our laundry. Smartphones are important, apps are important, not because we use them to do that task, but because they surround all the things that we do in relation to them. And that's enough about that topic. What I want to do is to take you into the talk and to tell you I'll start with a couple of reasons why I think ethnography is important. And why I think it's important to really understand how people feel, how people experience their lives, how people imagine their futures, what they dream of, what they hope for, what they're anxious about. So how do we actually live in the world, and how do we think about and worry about what might happen next? So the first thing to think about is emerging technologies. How can we actually design new technologies that will really become part of people's lives? What do people want to take with them as they step over into their futures? Those are the technologies that will really count, not the technologies that we imagine futures for and design for, the ones that people will take with them, not the ones that we put into a future somewhere else. There are also new questions. What personal mobile technologies will people want? What will smart homes actually be? How can we really conceptualise how people will live in a smart home? Do we even believe in the concept of a smart home? What about future health? What about autonomous driving cars? And what about artificial intelligence? We know that all of those things can exist technologically. We know that they're all possible. We know that they could exist now. But they'll only really exist when they exist with the people who use them. So let's think about Alex's wonderful diagram of the space rocket with the bike on the other side. What we really need to think about is how will people make the technologies that are designed into the real technologies that they become, and how to actually design for that process, how to design for the possibilities that people will create with technologies. The other part of the problem or the question is the one about our digital futures. There's a really important reason why we need to think about these questions right now. Why do we need to change the way that we think about design and make design something we do with people and make the things that are designed things that people will take into the future with them and create possibilities with. We're really at a moment now where change is happening. I don't want to say it's dramatic change, because change is never something that happens dramatically overnight. We're never suddenly confronted with a new technological or social context. But there's some really interesting and important things happening now. We really need to understand questions like where value actually lies in digital technologies. Is a digital technology a product? Is it something, is it an object, is it an artifact, or is it actually a service? What about new forms of ownership? What about changing lifestyles? What about the question of what we trust in a digital environment? What is it that feels familiar enough for us to be able to click on a link, or actually use a new app, or purchase a new technology? Why do we trust in it? Why do we believe in it? And what are the new business models that are emerging around all of those new questions? Those are things we really should be worried about and start thinking about who the user is within those new configurations. So is the user really going to be doing the same kind of things, or using things in the same way, or using the same things in the future that the user is using now? So those are a couple of the reasons why I think we need to start really thinking about what people do with technologies and how people are going to move forward with them. Now, what I'm proposing as a way to think about those questions is a design ethnography approach to what I'm calling our uncertain digital futures. Now, there are three concepts that underpin the approach that I want to talk about. And those are creativity, contingency, and improvisation. These are things that happen in our everyday lives in the present, and they're also things that happen in our everyday lives in the future, or will happen in the future. Now, technology use in the present is contingent and it's messy. So the way we use things, it really depends on everything else that's happening around us. Now, I'm going to show some examples of that when I go on to the work that I'm going to talk about, and some of the ethnographic examples, because when you're an ethnographer, you always have to give examples and show videos and pictures and talk about real people and what those real people are doing. And we'll come to some real people's stories in a minute. But we always use technology in a way that's messy, in a way that's chaotic, in relation to all of those other things that are happening in our lives, and also in relation to the infrastructures around us, and in relation to the other people. Now, the other principle I want to talk about is that people do not do what we expect them to do with technologies, and I've got some fantastic examples of that. I'll show you the videos from some of them. And people don't do what we expect them to do. They even do the things we're not expecting them to do, in ways that we don't expect. People are very complex. Thirdly, technology solutions do not usually change people's behaviour. The behaviour change agenda is a really well-meaning agenda that seeks to make the world better. But there are countless stories of how people use and appropriate technologies in the ways that they need to in order to achieve what they want to achieve. People don't do what we expect them to do with technologies. And that's one of the basic reasons why, actually, we can't use technologies to change people's behaviour. We need to actually give people technologies that they will be able to use in ways that are beneficial. And that will lead to forms of change. But change directed through technology from above is very, very difficult to achieve. One of the good examples of that is the use of self-tracking technologies and digital health technologies to make people exercise more. About 50% or more of people who start using self-tracking technologies and wearables give up after 6 months. Some of the research we've been doing about that in Sweden and Australia really demonstrates that the reason why is because what the technologies are meant to do or are meant to ask people to do just doesn't have enough meaning for the people who use them. So how do we understand the meanings that people need and enable people to create those meanings with technology, thinking about it the other way around, rather than trying to direct people what to do? So, what if? Technologies can't be designed for a predictable future. We don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know what people are going to do with technologies exactly. We also don't know what this technology is going to do. Come on. Did two at once. What about then if technologies create possibilities for improvisation rather than solutions to problems? So what I want to look towards is a possibility-based approach, not a solutions-based approach. Solutions close things off. Possibilities open things up. Possibilities are much more exciting, but we've got to find them. And what if the technologies most useful to people are those that they can improvise with to achieve mundane, everyday goals? So the best technology would be one that you could use to stop you from ever having to do laundry again, to stop you from having to do anything that's boring in your life again. That might be hard to design, but technologies are really embedded in our very mundane everyday lives. So how can we really use them to make our everyday lives better? So those are the things I want to talk about and open up a discussion about. And then at the end, I'll also talk a little bit about how the design ethnography research I do is disseminated to industry partners. We'll also see examples of that as I go through the talk as well, because I'll be talking in particular about two projects in which I've collaborated with industry partners in the last years. Now, this is the last one with lots of words on, but they're always things that ethnographers want to say at the beginning, and we tend to put lots of words on our slides. So, what is design ethnography? What do we do, and how do we do it in the context of looking at technological futures? The first thing that, for me, is fundamental to ethnography is that we seek to get under the surface, and that's under the surface of everyday life. We try to see what's usually invisible, and we try to show what's usually unspoken. So we're interested in the visible and the verbal as well. We like observing what people do, we like interviewing people, and really focusing with people on talking about what they think they do. But what we also really like doing is trying to explore the world with participants in research in ways that show the things that they would never normally talk about because it wouldn't occur to them to talk about it. Now, the other thing is understanding how technologies are interwoven in our lives, how technologies are actually inseparable from our lives and defined by them. So everything, or nearly everything we do now, bears some relationship to digital technologies. We're surrounded by digital data. We can't see it, but in this room, we can think of ourselves as actually being in an environment where digital data is just as present as the weather outside. It's just as present as the air conditioning. It's actually something that frames and shapes our world. And it's also the way that we experience data can be almost as unpredictable as the weather. So we don't necessarily know if we're going to always have internet access. We don't know if it's going to be good. We don't know if it's going to be bad. We don't know if we're going to lose a file. We don't know if we're going to file our own work in an order that's really coherent. We don't know if we're going to lose something in our email archives because we don't know how to search it. There are many ways in which technology is really interwoven in what we do, as much as anything else. Now, another thing that design ethnography is fundamental to me in design ethnography is researching in mundane everyday life with technologies. I've already talked about how important the mundane is. The kinds of things that we research are morning routines and bedtime routines, laundry, family relationships, and things like archiving our personal data. Those moments when we get up in the morning and when we go to bed at night, key moments in terms of when we use things, we switch things off, we switch things on, we prepare for we end the old day, we prepare for the new one, and we start the new day. Those moments in our lives are really fundamental for thinking about what we need, how we pull things together, and what's meaningful to us. But those are moments in the day that it's impossible really to find out about normally. We try to learn about what really matters to people in the present and in their imagined futures. And really focus on experience and technology experience and meaning in technology. How do people use technologies to make themselves feel comfortable, to make themselves feel familiar, to make themselves feel right? What are those everyday routines of technology use that form part of all of your everyday lives? Who wakes up with their phone next to them? Who doesn't wake up with their phone next to them? Is that a better question? And I bet you all have familiar checking routines. You go to the same apps, you look through the same things. You may not find anything in those processes that's very useful to you, but you need to do it. It's very compulsive. So we have very familiar everyday routines of using technologies that just make us feel comfortable. We've done what we usually do. We can get out of bed, go and have breakfast. And the other important thing, the reason why we do design ethnography for technological futures is really to think about the implications of all of these things that we do with technology now for our digital futures and what they might actually entail. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the projects I'm already doing. I work in different places around the world, developing, designing, and undertaking design ethnography projects. I can't talk about the findings for all of these projects because some of them are ongoing and some of them with industry partners, but some of them I can. Now, does anybody know what this is? I know some people do because I've told you, but okay, does anybody know where it is? Does anybody have an idea of where it is? Okay, so this is in Sweden. And it's not real. Well, the photo's real, but this is not real. This is actually a constructed town. You can see in the top of this picture here that there's nothing inside those buildings. This is a place where they test cars. They do all kinds of tests on cars in the Swedish woods, and it's a false town. It's absolutely remarkable. And I'm showing you that as a reminder to myself that one of the projects that I work on is in Sweden about autonomous driving cars. And as an example of the kind of research that design ethnography is appropriate for. If we want to understand our digital futures, then we really need to understand how people are using all kinds of technologies and looking specifically at emerging technologies. So we know that autonomous driving cars could go on the road almost straight away. But we don't necessarily know how people will experience them, what their expectations are of them, and how they use them. So this project, which is called Human Experience and Expectation of Autonomous Driving Cars, the HEAD project, is one that we're working on with design ethnography techniques in Sweden at the moment. Now, this is a picture of our research team in Australia. We have several projects in Australia. And this is a project which is about urban sound transformation systems. And in this project, this is our whole team. My ethnography team worked with sound designers and sound artists and acoustic engineers. And the engineers and artists developed sound cancellation systems and sound transformation systems and used those to transform a motorway sound. My team did an ethnographic study of how people experienced that transformed sound. And this is our team together on the site where we did our research. So that's another thing that design ethnography can be used for, to really get under the surface of people's experience, their sensory experience of digitally transformed aspects of their sensory environment. Now, this photo is of a market, the market in Melbourne. It's the ceiling, the roof of the market in Melbourne in Australia. Another of our projects is looking at the design of the markets, and as the market is transformed, what the experience of the vendors and the people who go shopping in the market is. This is another project which is called Unlocking Digital Assets. Does anybody know what this is? A drone, well done. Yeah, this is a drone being made in a makerspace in Melbourne. And in this project, we've actually been trying to understand what a digital asset is and where value lies in the process through which a digital asset actually comes to have value and meaning in the world. Again, we've been looking at that ethnographically by exploring a whole range of different uses of technology and technology design, ranging from drones through to Bitcoin and blockchain. And this, does anybody know what this is? Is this one easier? This is a construction site in Australia. And again, we've been doing design ethnography research in this context by actually understanding, looking at how construction workers stay safe, and also looking at how construction workers use digital technologies and digital videos that have been created of them working safely that they can access through QR codes online. So for all of these projects, what we actually do is we actually go and inhabit the worlds that the participants that we're interested in live in. So for this project, we had a researcher on the construction site filming and being with construction workers and talking to them. In our digital assets project, we were hanging around in makerspaces, in the Bitcoin Centre, etc., in other places. In all of our projects, we actually go in there, into the world with people, and really try to collaborate with our participants of our research to understand how they feel about things, how things come to have meaning for them, how they experience technologies, relationships, the environment that they're in, what kind of activities they're involved in, and importantly, how they feel sensorially and emotionally about those worlds and experiences. This is a project which I'll talk about more in a little while. This is a project that I undertook in Indonesia with Unilever, and in this project we were trying to understand people's relationships with their washing machines. It's a project about the new middle classes in Indonesia. This is a slide from the project where the researchers really participated with the research participants and understood how they actually undertook all of those tasks in their homes. So that's a range of the different projects in different countries that I've been working on. Most recently I was in Ecuador working with the concepts of contingency, improvisation and creativity, looking at questions around public health and indigenous health there as well. So those three concepts, looking at the way people are creative in the world, looking at the contingencies that surround what they do, and the way they improvise, underpin most of the work. There's some other concepts that underpin the work. One of them is the concept of digital materiality. Now, the idea here, and this is a book that I edited with two colleagues from Spain, and the underpinning idea here is crucial for thinking about how we understand technological design ethnographically. The digital and material are now not things we can think of as being separate. I just talked about how data is really part of our environments, almost as much as the weather and all of the things that are around us. The way we try to think of the digital and material now, when we do ethnography, design ethnography in a technological world, is really to think of them as a form of digital materiality, where everything that occurs and happens and is created has digital and material elements within it that can't be separated out. As I said before, we see digital data as part of our environments, and we actually ask the question of how do people really live in this kind of world, and how do people participate in bringing together the digital and material as part of their lives and as part of their activities. Now, this is another recent book called Anthropologies and Futures. This one will be published in a few days' time, I think, or maybe last week, very soon. Now, the key message of this book is that our futures are always uncertain. We really can't know what's going to happen next. Now, in design, sometimes predictive modelling is used. Now, we can do predictive modelling in economics. In fact, the idea of predicting the future for an economist is not problematic at all. For an ethnographer, the idea of predicting the future is almost impossible, because we know that we can't really ever know what's going to happen next. We can imagine a future, we can assume a future, but something might happen. It might be a global crisis, it might be a change in government, it might be something smaller in our everyday lives. And that future that we had imagined might vanish, it might evaporate, it might have a whole generation of students who are at university who imagine that they're going to be leaving and getting jobs straight away. Suddenly a big economic crisis hits. Where are those jobs? Where are those futures? Everything seems to have changed. So big data is also being used a lot now in a predictive way. We hear of data-driven policy, we hear of data-driven design. Those are also concepts that, for an ethnographer, are deeply problematic, because we don't really know what people are going to do in the future. We don't know what's going to happen next. So can we really rely on these kinds of predictive forms of modelling as to stand for a future that we can design into? I don't think we can. I don't think we should dismiss them. I think we could use them as being indicative. We can use them to help us to imagine futures. But we don't know what's going to happen next. The closest we can get to understanding what might happen next is to actually understand what people already do. And by understanding what people already do, we can start to think about how those people might take things that they encounter, new technologies that might be designed, into the future with them. There's an important thing about the future, which I think is really important. And this is one of my colleagues who edited the book with me, Andrew Irving, suggests that the future is continuously shaped, sometimes minimally and sometimes radically, by the actions of others on an intensity and scale that takes us beyond the limits of scientific understanding. And I think it's crucial that we keep that in mind always when we're thinking about how we might try to influence the future, we might try to create change in the future, but also for when we think about what we might design for the future. Now, uncertainty then really underpins the question of what might happen next. But uncertainty isn't always bad. And the other side of uncertainty is possibility. Now, this is a book that we now have the cover design for. We haven't actually finished it yet. And underpinning this, so this will be published next year, but underpinning this idea then is the idea that was in the title of my talk, the technological possible. The technological possible is really interesting for me because I think that technology design creates possibilities, not solutions. And that's what's really exciting about design. The idea that it can create a possible thing that goes into the future, that's not closed, that's not predetermined necessarily, because it's the people who use it that will make it into the thing that it could possibly be. Design anthropologists talk about what they call ethnographies of the possible. So ethnographies usually, traditionally, anthropologists have always researched what's already happened and then written about what happened in the past. That's important to understand, but we also need to understand ethnographically what could happen in the future and to use that as a way of thinking about what we might be designing into. Ethnographies of the possible involve working with research participants to imagine the possible futures that they could live in, maybe to prototype those futures and invite them to live in them or to live with the technologies they've imagined for them for a time, but also not as a way of testing technologies, no, not as a way of thinking about functionality, but as a way of thinking about how people start to take those technologies into the future with them, what they do with them, what they might be able to do with them, what possibilities those technologies open up for them. So the possible means an open idea of the future. It sees the future as dynamic, as changing. It doesn't close down the idea of the future, with the idea of creating a model of the future, something that might happen, and then designing a solution to put into it. Now, a focus on possibility is also aligned to an approach that focuses also on contingency and improvisation. Because what we do with technologies, when they're open, they create possibilities for us, is that we improvise with them. And it's our human capacity to ongoingly improvise that actually determines what the possibility that the technology offers us will be. So, to sum up these concepts of contingency and improvisation, they enable us to do certain things, to think about how everyday life is lived out, to open up our thinking beyond the search for design solutions towards thinking about design possibilities. So contingency is a great concept, because contingency enables us to actually think about everything that everything that's happened to us. And if we wanted to, we could piece together the stories that frame what's happening to us now. Now, that might be on the level of a life narrative, or it might be on the level of what we do on our everyday life routines. But if everyone here in this room was to tell me the story of how you came to be in this room at this moment, we'd actually have a world of contingencies. Because a whole chain and series of events have happened in your lives, some of which might seem purely accidental. Some of them might seem to be a matter of luck. Some of them might be you might think that they're down to hard work. Some of them might be because you met somebody in a room, or when you were at university, or somebody inspired you. And you suddenly found yourself in a situation where you're working for the company that you're working for, and that led you to be invited to come to this seminar. But a whole story, there's always a whole story which will tell us how you got to be somewhere at this particular moment. But contingency also happens in our everyday life routines. We do certain things in our everyday life routines because of everything else that's happening around us. And that's what it's really fascinating to unpack ethnographically. Why do people do things in their everyday life routines that seem strange? What are the logics behind the way that we actually do things? Now, a story from one of my research projects tells that really well. One of the projects that I'll introduce further in a minute has a website called energyanddigitalliving.com. Now, within that project, which was a big 4-year collaborative project that I worked on with engineers and designers in England, within that project, we did ethnographic research with people in their homes about their energy use. And the idea was that the project would create prototype apps or digital technologies that would enable people to reduce their energy use. Now, at the beginning of the project, I did a video. I video recorded and interviewed one of the participants, who's called Rhodes. Rhodes was great because she was a designer. She was actually in a sustainable design research group, if I remember rightly. She really cared about sustainability. And the way she lived in her home reflected that, as far as she was concerned. And it did in many ways. Now, as you know, in England, it's quite cold, and we have central heating systems in our houses. And when we were downstairs in her house, Rhodes told me that in her house, the heating was always lower. And she thought that you should wear a jumper to keep warm instead of turning it up 2 degrees, because that was much better than actually wasting energy by having the heating higher. Anyway, we toured her home, and in the end, part of my research was actually looking at people's bedtime routines. So we went to her bedroom, and she started to show me on the video what she did when she went to bed. Now, she went into her room, and she put the light on next to her bed. The light had an energy-saving bulb in it, but the energy-saving bulb heated up really slowly, because actually it was the wrong bulb. So she put the spotlights on as well. And she left them on because she needed them on, because the energy-saving bulb wasn't powerful enough. Now, it took quite a long time for that to heat up. So she put the television on. Then she went into the bathroom to have a shower while she was waiting for the light to heat up. So she really thinks she saves energy in her home, but actually she has the television on and the spotlights on. They're all using energy because the energy-saving bulb is the wrong one. And then she goes and has her shower. Anyway, when she comes back, she can switch the spotlights off, and that's okay. And when she decides to go to sleep, she switches the smaller light off. And then she goes to bed with the television on. Now, her and her husband have the television on at bedtime because that helps them to go to sleep. Now, but they don't want to get out of bed and switch the television off, because the whole reason for having the television on is so that they can go to sleep with it on. Does anybody here go to sleep with a television on? Or radio? Or music? Yeah, one? Some people? More people? It never occurred to me that anybody would do that until I did this research project, but a surprising number of people go to sleep with the television on, or music on, or something on, and they put it on a timer. And when it goes off, it goes on to standby mode. Standby mode is also not a very good thing to do if you're trying to save energy, because standby mode uses a lot of electricity. Now, for an engineer, I guess, or in engineering studies, at least, of standby mode, standby is considered to be waste. Because you're wasting it, yeah? Would anybody disagree that you're wasting energy when you're using standby mode? And that's what you would first think. But actually, Rhodes and her husband were using that technology to go to sleep. So standby mode actually is something they were using. They were users of standby mode as a technology that would enable the television to go off so they didn't have to get out of bed. So were they wasting energy, or were they actually using it for a particular purpose? And that's what ethnographic studies enable us to understand better, is actually what is somebody using a technology for? Are they using or are they wasting? And why is it important to them? Why did it matter? And also, why couldn't things be different? People have very busy lives. So the reason why the spotlights were being wasted because they were on when she wasn't using them, when she was using the smaller light, is because she's busy. She's got a small child. She hasn't got time to get the other light bulb. So again, she's using technologies to compensate for the other things in her life which prevent her from actually being able to achieve a more environmentally sustainable lifestyle. And these complexities unfolded continually in the research we did with all of the people in our project. And those are the contingencies of everyday life. And then people improvise. People use technologies in all kinds of ways to enable them to achieve what they need to achieve. So if you need to go to bed at night and get up in the morning, it's much more important to be able to do that than to get out of bed and switch your television off and then not be able to go to sleep. Because what you really need to do is to be able to continue with your life. That's a fundamental need for absolutely all of us. We need to be able to do what we need to be able to do next. And we improvise to find ways to do that. And those improvisations might not be what the technology designers thought we were going to do. Okay. Now, it's not only the present that's contingent, though. Our futures are contingent as well, because our presents are contingent. So what we do in the future is not going to be solved by a technology solution. Rhodes' situation couldn't be solved by a technology solution because her future will be just as complicated, just as messy, and just as contingent. So, we need to acknowledge what my colleague Andrew Irving, whose writing I love, has also said. He's used this term called the radical contingency of the future. And he says we need to acknowledge those, but also futures that we do not and we don't know and we will never know about. So we can imagine all kinds of futures. Other people are also imagining other futures. Some of those futures will never happen, but they're still relevant in the present. They still influence other futures because they're part of our imaginations. They're part of our cultures. They impact on the way that we create things and design things that will create possibilities in the future. So that's contingency. Now, improvisation. Two anthropologists, Liz Hallam and Tim Ingold, whose work is excellent, also argue that improvisation is a necessary condition because there is no existing template that instructs us in how to deal with the continually changing contingencies of life. We always improvise because when we're in situations like that of Rhodes, who needed to pull together all those technologies and all those everyday needs she had to make her life work and to be able to go to sleep and get up in the morning, there are no templates, there are no ways, no things that we can look up or we can be taught that actually prepare us to deal with any situation that will unfold. But we usually always know enough, and we can usually always guess enough about what might happen next to be able to improvise, to be able to take that step between what we know, what we don't know, and what we think we know. So, and this the design anthropologists Wendy Gunn and Clausen have also said, it's by improvisation then that people find ways of keeping on going. It's this never-ending moment of improvisation in the face of contingency. And that's the moment that I believe that we really need to understand as design ethnographers. How do people improvise? If we can understand how people improvise in the present, then that will give us clues to help us to understand how people will improvise in the future. That helps us to think about what the technological possible and human improvisation can do together. So, 3 key principles. Technology use in the present is contingent and it's messy. People don't do what we expect them to do with technologies, and technology solutions do not usually change people's behaviour. Rather, people use and appropriate technologies for their needs. Now, I want to actually now show you some examples from our research projects that will give you an idea of how this plays out in the kind of ethnographic research that I've been doing. There are also things that you can look up, because some of my work is publicly disseminated online. This is one of my websites, energyanddigitalliving.com. And in this project, in this website, I have a series of pages that explain the methodology, how we do the ethnography, how we actually create academic findings from the ethnography, how we then create categories for designers to use from the ethnography. Then there's another page where the designers have actually written about the prototypes that they created on the basis of our categories. And a final page, which is a video archive. And in the video archive, you can click on almost 40 video clips that we've selected and had agreement from our participants to put online, all of which give snapshots into those contingent moments, those everyday routines, the improvisations, and the way that people use digital technologies and energy in their everyday lives. Throughout the website, on the different pages, we have video clips inserted. We used a particular tagging technique to actually bring short clips into all of the discussions so that the video clips demonstrate most of the arguments and ideas that we put forward. Now, I'm not going to show you videos from this particular one at the moment, partly because some of the English accents are quite difficult to understand, and because of the difficulties of using this technology, another contingency, with the website. But I want to introduce you to some of the participants. Now, this is Alan. Alan was a fantastic participant. Sometimes when you do ethnography, you have some participants who are marvellous, and they show you things that you would never have realised before. And they give you ideas that are inspiring, and then you find that actually the things that they do are also hidden within the routines of other participants as well. You start to build up your story and understand some of the key things that are really important. Now, Alan was really interesting. in many ways. He had some very idiosyncratic ways of using lighting when he arrived home at night. He had a whole system of lights, which you can see in his video clip on the website. One of the most interesting things about his video was that it showed us that when he walked around his home at night, he switched lights on and he went backwards and forwards. He didn't need any of the lights, actually. And it really opened up our eyes to asking questions about, why do people actually follow particular routines? Why do those routines make them feel comfortable and familiar? One of his routines was a family routine. And it's something that he'd invented in his home. Now, at bedtime in his family, it was very important to switch the television off. For him, it's one of the fundamental things. Television and all of the technologies around it. Now, nearly all of our participants had routines at bedtime where they did a lot of switching off and checking and locking. That's what British people do at bedtime. They watch the television until they go to bed. They get up, switch the television off, they lock the doors, they lock the windows, and they switch off the other televisions in the other rooms. It's very typical. Now, what's interesting is that actually there are plenty of switches you can buy which would just switch everything off. But it appears that they're not necessarily that popular. Now, in his home, what was really interesting was that he had said that his daughter felt uncomfortable if everything wasn't switched off, because she didn't want the electricity to be on at night. She wanted everything to be switched off. So he'd invented a technique, he'd improvised. Now, it's quite difficult to get behind his television to switch everything off on the wall. So he had a stick. Now, sticks are really important, and there are quite a lot of sticks in my research. And it really made me think, why do you need a smart home? Why do you need a smart home if you've got a stick? Really? And he was really proud of the system with the stick. It was just a stick, and it was behind the television. And the last person to switch the television off at night would use the stick, because you could reach it behind with the stick in the wall and switch the television off. It was perfect. But actually, a really interesting thing about Alan's home was that we toured it, and I video record people touring their homes and showing me what they do in their homes in relation to the theme and the content of the project. And when we went up to his bedroom, he showed us where he went, what he did, and when he went to bed at night. And next to his bed was an alarm clock, and I said, "So, do you switch that off then?" And he said, "No, of course not. It's my alarm clock." That's on. And then we continued touring the house, and we walked past the Wi-Fi, and I said, "Oh, do you switch that off at night?" He said, "No, that's always on. Of course we don't switch that off." So actually everything was switched off at night. Now, if you just interviewed somebody, you'd write in your notes, everything is switched off at night. Fine. But actually, when you get into people's homes and their lives and you start to really, really interrogate with them collaboratively what they really do, by looking at the things they use and asking them questions, people don't actually do what they say they do. In fact, but they don't even know what they do, because what people do is so ingrained in our bodies. Our knowledge might not be in our heads. Our knowledge is in our legs or in our hands. The knowledge about when I switch the light off is in my fingers. The knowledge about how to walk up the stairs is in my legs and in my feet. So we really need to go to understand how people use technologies and when they use them and how they understand those uses and the logics behind them. We really need to go into their lives with them and pull out those things that are invisible, those things that they would never usually speak about. And they wouldn't usually speak about them because why would they? There was one moment in this video where he looked at me as if I was completely crazy. Because why would anybody want to know the things I was asking him about? Why would anybody want to see the things I asked him to show me? Why would somebody want to know how you switch your lights off when you go to bed at night? This is Lee, he's another participant. He also switched everything off at night. When he left his living room, he picked up the cat and he put the light on. So he didn't put the light off when he left the room, he put the light on. He put the cat out in the kitchen. Then he went and switched the television off at the wall in the kitchen. The reason why he put the light on when he went out of the living room is because he had the cat. When he came back in, he didn't have the cat. He left the light on to remind himself to go into the living room to switch off the television there. Anyway, he switched off the television. He went upstairs. He was a perfect research participant. You should watch his video because he even made a special sound when he brushed his teeth. Anyway, then he went into his bedroom. When he went into his bedroom, he used his mobile phone as a light. He showed us that because usually he does that when his wife is asleep so that he doesn't wake her up. He thought that was a really great invention. Does anybody else use their mobile phone as a light? Yeah, probably everybody. But we don't always talk to other people about it. So when we did this project a few years ago, he said it was a really clever thing to do. But everybody does it. But until you start doing research with people to understand what people really do with their technologies, you don't know. Was the smartphone designed to be a light? It's got a torch on it, but people don't necessarily use that. You only need to use the screen. Anyway, he would go to bed. But then he had another television in his bedroom. So that's at least 3 televisions in his house. Now the television in his bedroom, he didn't bother switching that one off at the wall because he couldn't, because it was behind the furniture. So it's very important to switch things off. It's very important to do all of these things until you can't. So again, the contingencies, the things around us that stop us from doing things, we don't let them get in our way. We actually do the best we can so we can carry on to the next thing. Okay, so now this is another project that I am going to show you some videos from. Now this is a project we did about everyday life and environmental sustainability in Indonesia, specifically looking at washing machines and the Indonesian middle classes. The first thing I'm going to show you is a trailer, because this is a project that I collaborated on with Unilever in the UK. And at the end of the project, during the project, I worked with another anthropologist and I also worked with a documentary filmmaker. At the end of the project, we made a documentary film, which is now being screened at some film festivals and is also being used in the business by Unilever too. And first I'm going to show you a trailer from the film, so you can get a sense of what we're trying to do in the film and in the project, and a sense of the wider group of participants who we actually put in the film. We had more participants than those in the film. Then I want to show you 2 specific video clips from that project, which for me just encapsulate how people use technologies in ways that they're not expected to, and also how people improvise. Okay.
Although it might seem a mundane activity, laundry is a concern for environmental sustainability agendas, locally and globally. But it's not always simple to navigate everyday life in an environmentally sustainable way.
Kimi ini makan banyak air enggak ya?
Iya, banyak.
Terus airnya dari mana?
Dari sumur direndam, dipisah-pisah mana yang putih, mana yang tebal, yang terlalu kotor harus disikat dulu.
Enggak langsung mesin cuci enggak?
Isu air, isu lingkungan seringkali jadi tagline atau stiker atau apa namanya iklan masyarakat, tapi tidak pernah dilakukan ya. Kalau kita mau melakukan ya lakukan sendiri.
Mungkin nggak ada alat yang masukin kemudian keluar langsung rapi gitu. Saya sih berharap seperti itu.
One piece of the jigsaw of designing for sustainable futures is to learn from people in the places where they live and to understand how their everyday knowledge, their dreams, hopes and ambitions can connect to this.
next clip is one of my favourites from the film and from the whole research. This clip is one of my favourites from the film and from the whole research project. There's a moment in it which was so important for me, which is when Nadia, my colleague, said to the participants, "So why don't you use your washing machine to wash the clothes?" So let's watch the clip and find out.
Ini dimasukkan titian yang sudah direndam pewangi tadi. Caranya menata untuk dikeringkan begini.
Oke. Nah, sekarang terus apa?
Ini.
Ya.
Sini kali. Satu kali. Dah.
Ya, jadi ini cuma
jadi keringkan itu tok udah.
Mesin cuci kan bisa untuk nyuci baju juga, untuk bilas juga. Kok nggak pakai mesin cuci aja, kenapa?
Saya nggak suka. Ya gimana nanti bajunya kan cepat rusak mbak, yang ada gambar-gambarnya itu loh. Oh, jadi Mbak Simbok lebih tahu. Kalau ini seperti ini cara jadi masih awet dari dulu warnanya ini. Ada gambarnya kan mbak, sablon kan kalau di mesin cuci cepat rusak. Jadi Simboknya itu dulu baru biar awet. Pakaiannya awet. Ya biar cepet ya mas. Agak lama, udah lama tapi masih bagus ini, warnanya. Gitu. Celana saya hitam saya ini sudah lebih dari 10 tahun. Masih bagus hitamnya.
So, generally, people believed that washing machines damage your clothes. Now, this was an extreme example. Most of our participants did wash their clothes in the washing machine, but there were certain clothes that they would never wash in a washing machine. And for me, this particular moment in the work was really important because it really showed how people developed their own uses for technologies. The washing machine was great, it was really useful to them, but only for certain things. And actually, every Thursday, they washed all of the clothes in those round containers. Okay, now the final video is another stick. So could we show the final one, an example of improvisation?
Adalah instalasi seni dari rumah kami karena rumah kami kecil. Model menggunakan lorong untuk mengoptimalkan tempat menjemur itu juga di keluarga saya dulu juga seperti itu. Pertimbangannya kami juga dulu merencanakan atapnya transparan juga karena untuk menghemat listrik juga nanti kan pencahayaannya optimal dan kebetulan bisa untuk menjemur.
So, another stick. So why do you need a dryer when you have a stick? Why do you need a more sophisticated technology when you've just got a stick which you can use to hang your clothes up? Now I've got one more example which I want to talk to you about quickly. This comes from a project that I do about wearables and self-tracking technologies that I work on with colleagues in Sweden. And I've called it self-tracking your own way. And I want to tell you the story of David, one of the participants. Now, David was somebody I met to interview and so he could show me how he used the technology. And he had a jawbone up. Does everybody know what a jawbone up wearable is? A wristband that at that time tracked his steps and his sleep and various other things. But when we met, the first thing that he showed me was this. It was broken. So I said to him, how did that break off? And I've put the whole conversation here. He said, I don't know. It just wasn't there, it fell off without me realising at all that it was already gone. So I couldn't ever find it. Then it worked for a while with me, poking it, maybe for about a week, and now, see it says here, that's on his app, alarm, trouble connecting, and I think it's dead. So he'd improvised for a while, he poked it, tried to make it work, then it stopped working. And I said, do you think there's anything you can do about it? So anyway, he started to tell me how he'd looked up solutions, but he didn't think they would work. So in the end, in that example, he eventually bought a new one. But that's one way in which the technology doesn't necessarily always work in the way you want it to. You find ways to deal with it. But there's something else about the wearable, because has anybody had a jawbone up wearable? No? I had a jawbone up too. And the problem with the jawbone up was that if I was going to cycle, it wouldn't actually know it was cycling. Whereas you've got other apps like Moves, which know when you're cycling, and they just register it automatically. And I would have to tell it that I was cycling, but I'd have to go into the app to tell it, and it was really tedious. He had the same problem. So he found a solution. He puts it in his jeans pocket when he's cycling. Now, there's a reason why he does that, because obviously it doesn't actually record his cycling as cycling. Yeah, and I said, oh, people said I should put it on my ankle. His wife put hers on her ankle, though, and it broke. So I decided to take the advice and not do that. But the thing is, what happens, he found, is when he put it in his pocket when he was cycling, it didn't register his cycling, but it counted steps. And that was great for him, because he wanted it to count something. He wanted some acknowledgement that he was actually doing some exercise. He didn't actually, he said, I still want it to know. He wants the app or the technology to know that he's exercising, even if it isn't counting his exercise as the exercise it really is. So what he really wanted was he wanted to get steps for his cycling. He didn't care that it was inaccurate at all. That didn't matter. So we also talked about when he goes swimming. He doesn't actually also tell the app when he's swimming. So actually the data that he's collecting is not correct and it's not accurate. But is that actually important? The technology is designed so we can collect correct data about how many steps we walk, how much we sleep, how much we cycle, how much we swim, etc. But for the user, that might not be what they want. The user might just want to get some steps counted when they're cycling. So I asked him then, we'd also been talking about third parties and organisations who also harvest the data and what it might mean to them, why it might be useful. So I said, well, do you think your data, how useful do you think your data is to them if you take it off when you go swimming and you don't tell it when you're cycling? He says, I don't care. I don't feel I have any responsibility to give them accurate data. He says, that's a funny idea, but it's true. If everybody's using it like I am, then their data might just be completely compromised. So, how do people really use self-tracking technologies? Do they actually care if the data is really accurate or not? They don't. Some people play with them. One person I interviewed talked to me about how sometimes when he was having a break from work, he would play with the heart rate data. He said, if I do this, it will go up. If I do this, it will go down. So he's not recording his normal everyday heart rate. He's actually recording himself playing games with a heart rate monitor. So, what do we learn? Technologies actually, there are many things we've learned, but technologies can't be designed for a predictable future or for predictable people. Technologies actually create possibilities for improvisation. They don't create solutions to problems. People create possibilities with technologies. That's what we've seen in all of these examples. So the technologies that are most useful to people are those technologies they can improvise with to achieve everyday mundane goals, like David with his self-tracker, like the women with the washing machine, like Rhodes with her timer and her use of standby. All these people are using technologies in ways that are not what was intended, but that are very, very useful to them to enable them to be able to go on with their lives, to carry on, to do what's important to them, and to do what they need to do next. And it's ethnographic approaches that actually show us how these contingencies play out, how they're improvised, how what people do emerges from the circumstances around them. We can't predict what people will do with technologies. We can't predict what they'll mean to them. And people don't do what designers intend. So there are implications there for designing technologies. There are implications for how we design personal mobile technologies, how we design smart homes. Do we design smart homes or do we just give people sticks? There's probably something good in the middle there between those two extreme options. But how do we design digital technologies for health improvement? How do we design AD cars? Or how do we design with artificial intelligence in mind? Thinking that people will always be living in contingent circumstances and worlds, and those will be the contexts in which they use these emerging technologies. There's bigger implications as well, because we need to think about how those things will emerge and happen in new digital futures. In new digital futures where value might lie somewhere beyond the product or beyond the service. In new digital futures where there are new forms of ownership and new business models. How will all that pan out? So that's the end of what I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to finish by talking a little bit about the way that we work when we do these projects. In the final slide, we work with a partnership model where we always develop research together with industry partners or with other organisations we work with. We share ideas. We very usually develop video techniques and digital sharing ways to disseminate the findings, like the video documentary and the clips and the websites I've shown you. It's all driven by a passion for research and design. It's always about partnering. It's always about working together and doing projects together. We also work with academic scholarship in these projects. I haven't talked a lot about the theoretical parts, but wherever possible, we do the ethnographic research. Then we actually write a series of academic articles and develop the work theoretically and pull the theory back into the applied insights that we develop and talk to industry partners and designers about. Finally, we always have regular project workshop with partners. We use the video documentaries and the clips to create poster materials, workshop materials, and conventional written reports. So really trying to work across a whole range of different techniques and materials to be able to create collaborative ways of working across different contexts and with different people and organisations. Thank you very much.
Agora, então, a gente vai começar uma rodada então, de discussão, de debate. Gostaria que vocês perguntassem, acho que ela vai estar circulando ali com os microfones, para vocês poderem fazer suas perguntas. Eu vou convidar o professor Alex de volta aqui para a mesa, por favor. E vou convidar também o Rodrigo Tobias, que também é do grupo de User Experience da Samsung, para compor a mesa. E vocês ficarem à vontade aí, por favor.
Vou começar em português, então, que a primeira pergunta que eu tenho é para o professor Alex. Primeiro, foi uma ótima apresentação, gostei muito do que vocês trouxeram de conhecimento para nós aqui. E a minha pergunta ela é a seguinte, talvez até possa ser um pouco filosófica, mais para saber a tua opinião. Mas, assim, o nosso cérebro, normalmente, ele é programado para esquecer. Tecnologia, de certa forma, ainda não. Pelo menos não necessariamente. O que pode levar a alguns problemas, inconsistências de inferências de perfis, sejam eles unitários ou sejam eles coletivos. Principalmente se a gente pensar em cenários onde a gente pode ter representações todas da nossa vida computadorizadas. E ao longo da vida, claro. Isso é apenas um problema que está na minha cabeça? Ou qual a tua opinião sobre isso?
Oi, Tiago. Obrigado pelo comentário e pela pergunta. Dentro dos processos de engenharia que a gente utiliza, hoje a gente tenta imaginar cenários negativos. Mas, como Sara colocou aqui de uma forma muito clara, são incertezas. Né? Quanto mais você conseguir antecipar cenários negativos, melhor. Mas eu acho que o que faz mais sentido é um momento onde você se aproxima do futuro progressivamente, tentando fazer o design de tecnologias que, de certa forma, conseguem sobreviver ao ecossistema atual, né? Aquela máxima do capitalismo, que você vai criar a demanda, que você vai criar uma coisa que vai ser desejável. Criar uma coisa que vai ser desejável, como está na base do conceito de inovação, é uma coisa que está ligada muito mais à emoção, né, do que a uma tarefa que você tem que cumprir, né? E outra mensagem muito interessante do trabalho da Sara é que, por mais cenários que você tente imaginar, uma coisa que eu tenho aprendido lendo os trabalhos dela, é mais interessante que você não faça uma tecnologia que é objetivada para uma determinada finalidade, mas que ela seja fácil de se encaixar no momento da improvisação. Então, então o nosso processo atual, né, precisa ser revisto, porque a gente é pouco informado de como é que é a vida, né, porque a gente está inserido nela, e a gente não consegue, está inserida na nossa, e a gente não consegue se inserir instantaneamente ou idealmente fazendo cenários futuros, como na engenharia de software normal, na vida de outras pessoas. Então, esse ciclo ele precisa ser quebrado. Então, a gente industrialmente, academicamente, tem que entender como é que a gente entra nesse dia a dia. E esse movimento pode, né, provocar aquelas inovações por escorregamento, como diria o Christensen, né, de tal maneira que elas possam sobreviver num curto prazo, mas, sobretudo, que é um aprendizado muito bacana do trabalho do design etnográfico, que é que a tecnologia precisa ser fácil de ser improvisada. É um jeito diferente de imaginar, porque normalmente a gente imagina o caminho feliz. A gente vai fazer uma tecnologia que é fácil de ser usada para o fim que a gente imagina. Mas como é que eu crio uma tecnologia que eu não atrapalho no momento que o usuário vai fazer o que eu não pensei que ele ia fazer?
Hi there, it's for Sarah. My name is Elson. I work at WIMI Innovation Consultancy, quite close from here, like 300 meters. And you told us, actually, the question's for her, but you can comment, feel free. You told us that technology creates possibilities and not solutions, which I think is a wonderful way, it's a wonderful approach. But since we had a solution and now we have possibilities, how can we measure it, or what is your experience in measuring all these possibilities when the industry asks us, how can you measure it? Like it's so wide.
Yeah, I think probably there's a different answer there, which is that you have to change the industry's expectations. But that's probably a longer term project. I guess the important thing is to actually really work towards demonstrating. I think measurement is difficult. Measurement is always difficult, and yes, there's always a demand for measurement. But I think the important thing is to work towards demonstrating how the opening up, creating possibilities works. That's the way you can audit them, but you can only audit them afterwards. So it's always an after the event way of saying, well, this is what happened. These are the possibilities that were created by technologies before. These are the unexpected possibilities. So one way to think about it is to document what's already happened and use that as an indication of the kind of things that could happen next. So a technology solution might have been developed. It didn't necessarily solve the problem that it was meant to solve, but it was used to create 1, 2, 3, 4 different possibilities. You can document the possibilities. And that's, I guess, is one of the things that ethnographic research can also do. It can go out there into people's real worlds and say, well, look, what are people really doing? This is a really successful technology. What are people really doing with it? What's its success beyond the intended success or the intended use? Document it and then present that as evidence. It won't be evidence of what a proposed technology can do to solve something, but it will be evidence that something will happen that's important. I could add to my last answer while we're waiting, because it just occurred to me that with self-tracking technologies, one of the really interesting...
Sorry, now it's working. My question for you, thank you for your presentation. The question is, I think that we have two quite distinct scenarios. One is when you're talking about hardware, for example, a washing machine and stuff like that. And the other one is when you're talking about software-based pieces of equipment. For example, the question is, when you have smartphones, for example, we have the Play Store possibilities that, let's say, as technology evolves and the behavior of people changes, what happens is that new pieces of software are available, becomes available. Let's say, the question is, perhaps, what's your idea in terms of, let's say, that would be a way to circumvent these difficulties would be to have hardware moving towards software-based stuff. For example, you have a washing machine, and you have, as you have a Play Store for that, you can adapt the system. The TV, for example, instead of you just has the buttons of the remote control, we have a piece of software that can drive differently the functionalities that you expect to have.
That's probably an engineer question.
You've got it.
Yeah. And I might not know enough about engineering to be able to answer the question in the way that you might hope that I could. But I think the answer is in understanding that technologies, I suppose to reiterate what I said before, technologies aren't solutions. They create possibilities. And to acknowledge the openness of the possibilities, and to realise that, yes, some people will use washing machines for different things. And yes, you're right that some technologies can be responsive to the improvisations, and those improvisations can become embedded in them as they go along, which I think is a really interesting and important way to think about technology design. I think one of the interesting questions is how to become sensitive to those improvisations. And that, again, is where I think design ethnography is really important. So do we wait for the improvisations to become evident? Or do we actually try to investigate not only that the improvisations are happening and then create a technology that is then upgraded to be responsive to them, but actually to understand why the improvisations are happening, what they mean, what the deeper implications of them are. Because that, I think, can tell us a lot more about how to design for what's next, rather than to design for what's now, and then see what people, and then adapt the technology to what people are doing with it now. Because that's not one step ahead. That's one thing in the present.
Antonio Marcon from Samsung. The question is based on your experience, your international experience. Design is an expensive resource for a developing country like Brazil. And so it's an asset that usually is not available for the entrepreneurs, particularly the startups, which are run on a very constrained resource scenario. How to approach these worlds together? How to get design as an expensive resource more closely to the startups ecosystem in a developing country?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure that I could answer it in any complete way. But I would think that one of the best ways to do that is to start in the education system. That might be what Alex was going to say. Because that doesn't solve the problem immediately, but it solves it quite soon. Because if you actually put design in the curriculum for any kind of engineers or technology development studies or program, then it becomes part of what's happening in startups. So I think that, yes, design will always be something that can be done by people who specialise as designers, but I think we need to have a lot more blending of disciplines. Design ethnography is a blend of design and anthropology most often. And I think blending design and engineering, or even better, blending all of those disciplines, is really the challenge. And I think that's also the exciting thing for the education of the future, and for people whose for the designers, engineers or ethnographers of the future to actually be able to be sensitive to and to understand the work of each other. So it means that maybe you can't necessarily always blend everything into one person's work. You'll always need the expertise of others. But developing the basis for those collaborations and for the understanding and to enabling an ethnographic sensibility and a design sensibility in engineers is really fundamental. Not just for startups, but also for big organisations. So for big organisations that can have a separate design department, separate engineering department, to actually make those departments able to work better together, and for engineers to be able to understand ethnographic and design insights when they come to them, rather than just, and for each discipline to be able to really understand how each other works so they can work together much better. For me, that's really, really important. And it's something that is coming about now across the world. It's not something that's easily achieved because we grow up in our different disciplines. We grow up actually being critical of the other disciplines. We spend most of our time in universities trying to learn about why other disciplines are wrong, not how we can work with them. Our teachers actually teach us that what they do is right and that what other people do isn't right. So we need to break all of that down and really start to think about how we can be very open, and again, open to the possibilities that come from bringing those different things together.
Yes, I agree with you. It's a very deep and complicated and complex and historical problem. And in this way, we cannot imagine an easy solution for this kind of necessity of our IT ecosystems and how we design new technology or how we design new companies. But if you consider the design as a human heritage, a cultural heritage, as you have many typical Brazilian cultural heritage for humanity, we can spread it around the world, but we can also use, incorporate in our own way of life this kind of reasoning. For example, in Scandinavia, when we used to send, when we have a lot of funds to send students abroad, and you know that, you from the academy, you know that we send using Ciências Sem Fronteiras, the program, so students can spend 1 year and a half a year abroad, and when students come back from New Zealand or Denmark or South Korea, I received many students that came from these countries, and they spend one year long in the fellowships and internships. When they come back, I asked them, what did you learn? What's the difference? Our disciplines? No, it's no difference. The content is exactly the same. But, you know, the difference is outside the classroom. Everybody talk about design. Everything is design. Well, design on the streets, the way the buildings are organized, the entry, the signs, so all the sideways, and the traffic placards. So you have design everywhere. So design is not exotic for them. It's incorporated in an overall and everyday way of life. For example, in Sweden, I never been in Sweden, but we know, reading and talking about colleagues, that in Sweden, any project, it doesn't matter if it's a small project or a big project, have to be planned for 2 years. A serious project has a 2 years project. So the assembly of people have to be rationally reflecting all along this period to do a significant or important project. And another thing is that, remember we are in Brazil. Do you know you have friends, or you are so young, you just finished entering university not so many years ago, you know what are the subjects that are more important. So you have to present to the university, you have to have a good grades on math, on science, on linguistics, or our natural language, it's Portuguese, and no other kind of subjects. History, maybe, biology, but in other countries, people is really taking serious the development of non-cognitive skills. What does it mean? For example, if you look for, it's very easy to find 21st century skills. What is important for many countries in the world, not far from our country? All the Pacific Union countries like Japan, Chile, and all the countries around the Pacific Ocean, they have conventions. And 10 years ago, they declared all the non-cognitive skills are extremely important and strategic for them. And in the non-cognitive skills set, we have the design mindset. So more important, learning math and Portuguese is important, we know. But as important or more important, to be a planned citizen in the world in the next year is to develop your design mindset, the abilities to work collaboratively with other people at a decent order in the same place. And many other kind of non-cognitive. Cognitive means the subject you have to memorize. So you have to exercise not only the content, but the reasoning strategies to be on time of what we are living now. The fourth industrial revolution demands workers that have this all set of abilities, cognitive abilities. So the answer is really when and where are we preparing people with this kind of knowledge, of this kind of abilities or cognitive skills to work on design technology? So, you know, it's a very, very complex answer.
Hi, Sarah. I'd like to thank you for such an inspiring talk that you had. And I have more of a technical question. So I've had a rather short experience on ethnographic research, and even though I really love the results of it, the insights that are gained, and the fact that we can really get to the real purpose of any problem that, that is really brought up by the user, I confess that I worry too much about the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is basically how one person's behavior is altered by the fact that they are aware that they're being observed. So do you have any techniques or strategies to ameliorate the data in midst of such an effect?
Yes. Anybody who participates in a research project is only ever a research participant. So you'll never get people to participate in research if they don't want to. And ethically, you shouldn't have them participate if they don't know. So the whole basis of my ethnographic approach is about collaboration in research. I don't want to observe people doing things when they don't know I'm there, or don't think I'm there, or in a completely natural way. And even if I could, how many times would I have to observe them before I knew the truth? I could never know the truth. There isn't something that you can get to which is pure knowledge, ever, in any subject, in any discipline, in any area of research. So the way I work is to create a collaboration with the participant where we're actually working together to try to understand what they usually do. And that's about probing what they usually do, trying to enable them to remember as accurately as possible what they think they usually do. And that's the very reason why I ask people to perform their everyday life activities for me. Because as I said before, when you interview people, they tell you what they think they do. They make it up, not intentionally, not in a bad way, but they join together what they think and they tell a narrative. When you ask people to perform things in their everyday lives, as I said before, there's certain things you do that you don't know about, you don't think about in your head. You actually do them in your body. It's a familiar activity. But when you enact it for somebody who's video recording you, then you realize, oh, I do this. And then you remember and say, well, do you always do it like that? I would ask. And they would say, well, usually, but actually yesterday, this happened. And then So what you're able to do is to actually draw on the experience and memory of a research participant over a long period of time to work with them to try to understand what they usually do. Now, it doesn't matter if you don't have a record or a register of exactly what they do. That's not what we're trying to find out in ethnography. We're actually trying to find out the principles for what they do, the basis of what they do. So it's about because when you do ethnography, as in any detailed study, you could get so much knowledge. What are you going to do with all of it? And it's always different for every person. So how do you pull all that together? That's an absolutely impossible task. So what we try to do is to actually understand how people are doing things, to abstract it, why people are doing things, and then see if those principles reoccur across all of the people in the project. Then you really know something. So if you really know that everybody does something similar when they go to bed at night, but they don't all do the same thing because all of their homes are different. But you do know that there are principles. And if you look at contingency as a principle, you can say, well, what are the contingencies? You can pull them together for each participant, and you start to see patterns. The same with the improvisation. How do people improvise? Then you'll start to see patterns, and then you start to get some general answers that then you start to be able to say, well, people usually do this because they're surrounded by these conditions. And that's when you can start to look at different contexts and different situations and see how people do different things in Brazil to what they do in England, to in Australia, to Sweden, because of the different things that surround them in everyday life. And different contingencies, it might be different infrastructures, it might be different cultural beliefs and different knowledge, it might be different types of biographical experience because they've lived a different history, or all kinds of different things. Yeah. So there's a method.
Sarah, as someone from the humanities, how do you feel about, well, improvisation is a big characteristic of what we can call as a human being. How do you feel about, what are your feelings about the development of artificial intelligence? How do you think about, what you really think about all those engineers that are trying to develop devices that tend to be more intelligent, and how they interact with real people?
I think artificial intelligence is one of the most exciting developments at the moment in terms of the possibilities that it invites for research in the social science and humanities. I think that there are a whole range of really important issues and questions that it raises for us, and which are philosophical as well as ethnographic. So how will people engage with artificial intelligence? What will people trust? How will people use it? How will they try to trick it? What will actually happen? And once people start to really engage with artificial intelligence, I think there are lots of very interesting questions there. What about when it breaks? What about when it's using incomplete data? What form will artificial intelligence take? Or in what form will people want to engage with artificial intelligence? Where will it be totally invisible? And where it's invisible and it's based on incomplete data, because data is always incomplete, because big data doesn't account for everyday life and its contingencies, what will happen then? So yes, there are some fears and anxieties around it as well. And the other thing that interests me is it all says, what kind of anxieties and fears and hopes do people have for artificial intelligence? And what do most people even think it is? And what will it actually be? So I think it's, in terms of as a technology that opens up possibilities, I think it's probably one of the most exciting ones we can think about at the moment. But of course, I'm worried about it as well, but not scared.
Aproveitar para fazer uma pergunta. Na verdade, a mensagem, eu acho que ficou, devolvo para você já, é que nós jamais abandonaremos a gambiarra. Acho que essa é a mensagem. A gente sempre vai fazer uma gambiarra. We are always improvising. Mas minha pergunta é para o professor, assim, você falou das 3 ondas da inovação, né? Então, começamos com a tecnologia forceps, as pessoas tinham que entender como usar, depois passamos para a usabilidade, onde as empresas passaram a ensinar as pessoas como usar, e a terceira onda em que as pessoas parecem, de fato, estar no centro, mas ainda assim de uma forma previsível, né? Como que eu vou prever aquilo que a pessoa vai fazer? Vocês acreditam que a 4ª onda seria exatamente isso, a questão a tecnologia do yourself, permitir que as pessoas façam da maneira que elas querem? Será essa a 4ª onda do user-centered design?
Renata, esse futuro é incerto. Because the future is uncertain. So she wants me to predict the future, the unfuture. Yeah. But we live in the future. The present, the future is mixed. So we consume already artificial intelligence. Every time we go to Google and we ask for a query, it's an artificial intelligence. Yeah? What if you find an executive from Google and the mindset of someone from Google say, tell me your name, I will tell you what we're thinking now. So it's the aim of this company is to, the mission is a wonderful mission, and we use a lot of artificial intelligence. But when and how artificial intelligence makes sense for people is in a very short term. You have, for many milliseconds, you use artificial intelligence, it gives you back an answer. It's wonderful. But if you try to talk or using a voice interface now, for example, in the Google Now applications, or Google Home applications, you very shortly find that you are not dialoguing. There are 2 monologues, and you are trying to make sense of the machine is doing. So it's the same problem when you are trying to control the electricity in your house. The technology is not dialoguing with you, and you never dialogue with you. So you cannot make any kind of intersubjectivity relation with a machine. It's maybe a science fiction myth. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we can achieve this level of artificial intelligence can be experimented in a future. But in the short term, or in the middle term, we are already interacting with artificial intelligence, but in very specific tasks. And it's not easy to design, a very complicated. You can imagine how much money people put on Alexa or in the new G8 voice interface just launched from Samsung. Cannot imagine how many knowledge is behind this project on ontology, on knowledge engineering, and it's a very difficult task to make technology make sense to people. It's very complicated.
What are the most challenges did you face in ethnographic research about the future and unpredicted data?
Oh, sorry,
the most challenges did you face in ethnographic research?
Challenges. That's a difficult question. I don't think there are not difficult challenges, or I don't see it as involving difficult challenges. Actually, I think that ethnographic research is always a pleasure to design and to engage in, and usually in my experience the people who I collaborate with and the research participants are always really interested in the project. And I think it's very important to ensure that the participants, I think a challenge is to make sure that the participants are interested and engaged in the project so that it's their project as well and it has some meaning. I think maybe if the challenges that I would say that Probably the most complicated ones are working across disciplines. So working with engineers and designers and ethnographers all together. Not because people are not willing, but because of the different timescales of projects and working out how to coordinate the work. And I think that now I've had experience of doing that across several projects, and every time we've learned more and more about how you can actually design an interdisciplinary project, where you should have meeting points, how you should design, because the design is also part of project design, but the design part of project design actually is something we should attend to much more as design. Especially when working in big interdisciplinary teams, because it's really important to ensure that you have the right meeting points to talk about the research frequently, but also to have the right forms of sharing and dissemination and communication between the different teams. So how can an ethnographer talk to an engineer and a designer when they're producing particular ways of knowing in the research? What kinds of texts should you use? How can you do it? That's one of the reasons actually why I use video so much, because a video clip can sometimes say everything. How can I learn to understand what engineers are saying to me in projects as well? So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and that for me has been also one of the biggest learning processes over the last, I don't know, how many years, almost 10 years now that I've been working with engineers across a whole range of different projects. It's really the challenge of bringing together the work of disciplines that have very different approaches to the world, have very different ideas of what knowledge is, and actually being open enough myself to understand that somebody else's work is not naive or wrong, and also to be able to communicate to them something about my work that enables them to not think that my work is wrong or naive. That, I think, is the really important fundamental challenge. And I think it goes back to what Alex was saying, and I was saying as well earlier, about embedding those kinds of approaches to being able to work together and to understand in education now from a really, really early point. Because those of us who've tried to work, who've started to do this work across disciplines, to bring together the different approaches, I think we've now started to understand what those challenges are, and also what needs to be done to be able to move forward, and for it to be easier for other people in the future, and for it to be actually part of a normal way of working, rather than being seen as a new or innovative way of working. I think it should be just normal, just what everybody does.
Just to complement, I'd like to return to the question of our colleague in front of you, when he was using the concept of software and hardware. Imagine an engineer using not this transcendental notion of knowledge as something that's invisible, but imagine both things as augmented tools that a cognition can use to augment the capability they can do. So, if the engineers can put in the place of the actor, not the user, but the actor, how can you imagine how a tool, an instrument, or something else, doesn't matter if a software or hardware, doesn't matter the substance of the solution, but what are the capabilities you want to give them? This is the difference between the framework, the theoretical framework of an anthropologist, and the theoretical framework or the notions used by an engineer. So it provokes a lot of misleadings from both sides, and the same thing with designers. So, and it takes it takes long to develop this interlanguage set of notions that will allow the flux of the co-design process.
Bom, a minha pergunta não é direcionada para uma pessoa específica, acredito que qualquer um de vocês três possam responder, ou se não todos. Bom, eu sou desenvolvedora e sou líder de uma comunidade de 1.300 desenvolvedores, que é o Google Developer Group aqui em Campinas, e eu tenho sentido uma necessidade muito grande de levar para os desenvolvedores essa consciência de realmente pensar no usuário. Acho que, como o professor falou, né, a nossa porcentagem, eu faço matemática na Unicamp, matemática computacional, e a porcentagem que a gente tem para parar e pensar no usuário, né, realmente, poxa, a gente não está criando código para uma outra máquina. A gente está criando código para uma pessoa. A gente está desenvolvendo um aplicativo, um back-end que vai atingir seres humanos. Né? E por vezes a gente deixa de pensar realmente nisso, digo isso como desenvolvedora mesmo. Mas eu tive algumas influências durante a minha experiência de mercado, entre elas a Lariane, que está ali, que ela foi uma grande inspiração para que eu parasse e pensasse, poxa, isso é realmente muito importante. Então, como que eu consigo inspirar esses 1.300 desenvolvedores a tanto pensar no consumidor final, como entender o trabalho de uma pessoa de um UX, né, de um designer, né? Então, porque eu vejo muito que existe uma barreira entre o desenvolvedor e o designer. Em várias empresas, várias pessoas que eu já conversei, existe uma barreira gigantesca que não consegue fazer com que as pessoas possam trabalhar juntas, sendo que todo mundo tem o mesmo objetivo, que é desenvolver um produto. Então, por que não existe esse respeito mútuo, né, dos lados de, poxa, eu tenho uma skill, eu tenho minha função, você tem o seu papel, somos uma equipe e temos um objetivo final. Então, como eu, desenvolvedora, posso fazer alguma coisa para inspirar a outros, como uma empresa pode ajudar a inspirar os seus desenvolvedores, e eu, como uma organizadora de uma comunidade, como que eu consigo criar ações para conseguir colocar essa consciência na mente dos desenvolvedores.
I will resume your question. She's a leader of a huge open software initiative at Google company, and she's asking how he can introduce this kind of reflection or of taking care, or taking account of the users in the design of new technology at Google. I understand your question, and I would like to answer not talking about computer science, but we can imagine a lawyer using design. Let's try to analyze, let's work as an outsider. Why that? Because a law transforms the life or impact the life of a whole population. You know, what we are discussing now, the reform of our security system. And when you write you can imagine that a lawyer only can deal with all the collections of laws already, the constitutions and the rules, etc. But the impact of a law is incredibly large. So what does happen if the lawyer could prototype the consequences of a law? What happens if he could reflect and design future scenarios? What happens if you can prototype different kinds of laws and simulate what will happen? What is good when you learn about, when you exercise yourself using the design reasoning process, is that you can deal with a large quantity of restrictions or variables. So when you are computing, without a computer, we cannot deal with more than 6 or 7 variables at a time. Use a computer, you can deal with, big data or data analysis. You can deal with a table with 60, 70 different variables, but it's not necessarily to use so many. You will very fast discover which are the more sensible variables to describe or to help you to identify what are the relations, what are the most important variables, and so on. And we do exactly the same, but not in a computer. When you are reasoning like a designer, using the design thinking, the design thinking as is famous now to talk about. When you put out and represent all those variables and you discuss with many people, in fact, you are doing what an analytics process do, computing. You are computing in your mind and sharing with many people Yet at the same time, you are reasoning about the relations among 20, 30, or 40 different variables, and with different natures, different kinds of variables, because you only can compute binary or numeral, ordinary, but you can't do many things with text, is more difficult, and qualitative variables or subjective variables is impossible to do when you are using a computer. So the design reasoning is this human capability to calculate a solution, the best solution or the optimal solution, considering a large number of variables. So how when you question how we can introduce this question, it's not immediately. We learn what we do to spread or form someone else to work using the scientific method. You know very well, it takes at least 10 years. You start when you are in the middle of the graduate, you do your master, you do your thesis, and when you are in the third year of your thesis, suddenly you say, oh, but I got it. I know how to, what do you mean? Once one of my former PhD students almost broke my door. I think he didn't sleep. He put the fingers on the door. He said, I understood. It's fantastic, but it takes so long. It was the second time he was doing a master. He dropped out in the first time and was doing the second attempt. And it took at least 10 years for someone to understand what is scientific, or to reason using scientific reasoning. It's the same with design. You cannot send an email to your community, 1,300 people, say, hey guys, let's use design reasoning. It's impossible, you know? One thing you can do is to invite designers and put them together. So one way for a human to learn a reasoning is imitating to someone else. It's what I do. I participate on open software communities, and we invite designers to be with us. So this is the problem with most of the open software initiatives. The user experience is more and more questionable in the last years. So it's not magic solution. The idea is that you can invite more people and to spread the knowledge that is more dominated by someone, and they can be learned little by little by the engineers.
Só complementando aqui, assim, acabar um pouco com os rótulos. Se acabar um pouco assim, isso é de coisa de engenharia, de design. Se você tratar como preciso solucionar um problema, já alivia muito. Tá? Experiência que passamos todos os dias na Samsung.
Okay, I'm Antonio Palma from Samsung Research Brazil. First of all, thanks a lot for your insightful and very rich talk. Thank you. My question is the following. Is for you both. Do you believe that ethnographic research represents an enabling approach or an enabling discipline for radical innovation, or just for incremental innovation? And if you do believe that it enables radical innovation, please give us a few examples. Thank you.
Yes, I believe. 10 years ago, you know, every year you have I don't know the name of the event, but you have the annual meeting at Apple. And every time is a kind of buzz behind this event. And 10 years ago, I don't know, the specialists on technology said in the next 20 years there will know a great breakdown on the flux of the innovation. And we are in the middle of the way, and until now it's confirmed. No, that's no big deal or a big impact or a big disruptive technology in the last 10 years, maybe in the last 15 years. And what does ethnography mean? What does ethnography mean? When you don't use ethnography, you used to be inspired by our more superficial reality. We have the competitors, we have the tasks, we have the problems, we have the frequently asked questions, we have the forum, we have the service, consumer service, we can listen, you have the maintenance network can inform us about what are the problems. We have the social networks, people claiming, etc. And their inputs is about the actual technology. If you improve this actual technology, your starting point is an object, and you can improve the usability of this object, and you have a second version. This is what is happening in the last 15 years. You are improving the experience little by little, but it's no disruptive technology as you are trying to do. What ethnography and ethnography design do is that you do two steps back. You forget your immediate reality, you forget your competitors, and you care about people. It's one of the first phrases I listened when when we received Sarah. You care about people, and you try to understand what is meaningful for them, and you try to understand what is significant for them. Then it's as if everybody was trying to find petrol in a certain region, and the people was going deeper and deeper, and suddenly you contract a small group of employees. You ask them to go very far away from here, use a different technology, and find a brand new opportunity for us. So ethnography is this. I don't want to say easy, but it's a different strategy. It's a different way to find a different landscape, a different opportunity, but a more significant for human beings. We are not trying to improve the actual technology, but we are trying to look for the pearls, the hidden pearls in the culture. They are hidden. What Sarah used to is the patterns. All the concepts are very, how can I say, powerful. They are like tools to discover these opportunities. It is the same thing. Ethnography do this, and design reasoning do exactly the same. The more you improve your design reasoning, the more you are able to see opportunities. It's incredible. They both dialogue very well.
Thanks. Yes, I think it's an interesting question. I think it also is a question that's, I think, as Alex expressed, is almost contrary to what ethnography does, in that ethnography wouldn't become... There are contexts in which ethnography has been done specifically for product design, to inform the design of a particular product, and that's in much more traditional design uses of ethnography. But the way I'm talking about ethnography wouldn't necessarily inform the design of a particular product that might be a radical innovation. And I think there's another aspect of the idea of innovation which ethnography can actually help us to think differently about. So innovation is often, when do we know that something isn't innovation? We only really know after it's happened. And I think the whole point about doing ethnography is actually acknowledging that we can't actually know what's going to happen with the thing that's being created or the technology that's being launched into a market. So ethnography enables us to think more about the possibilities that a technology opens up, rather than to determine what a technology needs to be to actually be a radical innovation. So it actually means that we have to think differently about the problem, and ethnography enables that. And I think that's also because ethnography also enables us to think in a much broader way as well. So it enables us to actually understand what a technology means in terms of a much wider context. So what will our digital futures hold? We don't know that. But we do know that if we think ethnographically about a technology, we can't think of that technology in isolation, or that technology and its user in isolation. We need to actually think of that technology as something that will be becoming part of a much more complex digital future, which I talked about in my talk. So the technology will be becoming part of a context where there are new business models, where we think about technology differently, where we think about ownership differently. So there's really a kind of an ethnographic understanding that pulls in a lot of other ideas and research about what would a disruptive technology disrupt? Because we don't actually know what the future's going to, totally what it's going to be like. So can we really know what an innovation will be if we don't know what the future's going to be, and we don't know what could be disrupted because we don't know what it is. And ethnography helps us to situate that and be aware of it. It makes it all a lot more complex, because it means that we have to confront the idea that we don't really know what's going to happen next, but that we can guess.
We have less than 1 minute. But a good way to finish a meeting like this is not to giving answers, but is to letting or creating questions. And one good question, to be provocative, is that how we can design a better future for people.
I'm a designer here at Samsung, and I have a question for you, Sarah. There's this saying that good design is actually invisible for the user, so it's something he takes for granted. But when you talk about design, for a lot of people, they think about fancy stuff and beautiful cars and beautiful chairs, and they don't think about a well-diagrammed bank receipts or something like that. So my question is, you say that technology should create possibilities, but do you think the good design, it happens when the improvisation ceases to exist and it's attended by something someone designed? Or you think it should, more than that, more than take a improvisation and make it something real for the people, but it should also make possibilities?
I think that good design should enable improvisation, or it should acknowledge that improvisation will happen and open up possibilities for people to use the technology in the way that will make them feel good and comfortable, and as I emphasised before, able to move on and do the next thing. So, and that's why I guess that's a way of thinking about the experience of design, because you're not just designing a technology or an object, you're also designing the possibilities for that object or technology to be experienced in particular ways, and for people to be able to do things with it which will generally make them feel good and make them feel better, which I think ties with Alex's comments about how do we actually design to make the world better for people. How do we enable people to make themselves feel better in relation to the things that we design?
Sarah and Alex, we're talking about a lot of things today. One thing we don't mention about art. What about art in this context?
Art is another reasoning, and I love contemporary art. It's amazing how we can learn, how we can... What is amazing with art, especially in countries like ours, is how they can, in a very fast and effective way, transmit a lot of things. So design can learn a lot with art. Engineering can learn a lot with how art reasoning or creativity reasoning, but especially art, because they are, to be an artist, I can answer your question citing Picasso. Everybody is born an artist. It's very hard to continue as an artist when you grow up. So it's natural to be designer, it's natural to be an artist. So what does an artist mean? It's to draw like a child. It's not to hesitate, it's not to be afraid with the mistakes. An artist is also a very smart way to compose one message using very short, and we appreciate when you see this in technology. When you see an object and you know how does it work. So art, especially contemporary art, do it very well, very well. It's amazing how we can. But to learn, we can learn this reasoning. But to learn, you have to visit, you have to interact, you have to be with them, be with artists, you have to read their histories. So it's a very good question.
I think that art fits into this into a really interesting way, also in relation to the questions of creativity and improvisation and contingency. But particularly because I talked about how they lead us to the possible. And for me, the art is really an embodiment of the possible and a way of expressing the possible and creating possibility. So our relationship with art is very much about our relationship with possibilities. Art isn't a solution. Art doesn't close things down. Art really creates possibilities. And I think that that's the really interesting universal parallel that we should keep in mind in relation to design and art and everyday life. Those three principles of creativity, contingency, and improvisation actually fall into that you can use those as modes of understanding all of those processes, and that's what creates the relationship between art and technology design, because I think that we can learn from art in technology design and its capacity, and it already creates the possible for us in our world. And I mentioned that I did a workshop in Ecuador in January, and there we were working with medical doctors, medical students in a medical school, and also with people from public health and a wide range of concepts. And we again used these concepts of creativity, contingency and improvisation, and I worked with another anthropologist who works in the medical school, and we invited an artist and poet to work with us. And it was in that workshop we brought their work together with the design ethnographic principles of creativity, improvisation and contingency, and really noticed how they correspond. So there's this lovely way in which I think bringing artists into a context of technology design could actually be a fantastic and very inspiring workshop.
Thank you, everybody. I'm very happy with the final question put by Mr. Alex. And if everybody here thinks in this way, am I working in something? Am I designing something that will construct, that will build a better world for people? If we can see it, I think this is the purpose, the real purpose of the event. So thank you very much for everybody. Thank you deeply, Mr. Alex, Mrs. Sarah. Thank you very much. And everybody is invited to a cocktail at the Mezzanino to take a toast with us, okay? And I would like to take a gift, to give a gift for you, if you don't mind. So it's a Brazilian gift to remember this day.